Paris is liberated on August 25th, 1944. The first Allied soldiers cross the Seine and enter the city, while crowds gather in the streets that 4 years of German occupation have kept quiet. 80 days earlier, those same soldiers, most of them, were on ships crossing the English Channel toward beaches they had never seen, in the dark, with no certainty about what the morning would produce. 80 days. That is the distance between the ramps dropping on Normandy beaches at dawn on June 6th and the city of Paris returning to French hands. It sounds clean when it is compressed into a single sentence. It is not clean. It is 80 days of hedgerow fighting and supply crises and command arguments and burning tanks and men dying on roads whose names they cannot pronounce, and it produces one of the most consequential military campaigns in the history of the Western world. The scale of what is assembled for the invasion is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind all at once. More than 5,000 ships cross the Channel, carrying roughly 156,000 soldiers on June 6th alone. Behind them, the planning has taken 2 years. 2 years of assembling, training, arguing about strategy, constructing artificial harbours that will be towed across the ocean in sections, calculating how many tons of ammunition a single armoured division burns through in a week of sustained combat, and maintaining the deception operation that keeps German reserves pointed at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy for the critical weeks when the beachhead is still fragile enough to destroy. General Eisenhower writes a note the night before the invasion, accepting full responsibility for its failure, just in case. He puts it in his pocket and does not use it. The beaches themselves tell 5 different stories on the morning of June 6th. Utah goes relatively smoothly. The landing drifts south of its intended position, which accidentally places it in a lighter defended sector, and the casualties are tragically low compared with what follows at Omaha, where the plan collides with geography and luck and German defensive positioning in ways that produce the most violent morning of the entire campaign. More than 2,000 Americans become casualties on Omaha Beach on June 6th. The beach is a killing ground for hours. Machine guns firing from the bluffs, artillery registered on the surf zone, the tide coming in over men who have been hit and cannot move. The fact that the beach is eventually taken does not soften what it costs to take it. Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches to the east, each carry their own weight of violence and near disaster, and each are taken. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies hold a beachhead that is shallow, costly, and alive. Then the Bocage begins. The countryside of inland Normandy is divided into small fields by earthen embankments, topped with thick hedgerows that have been growing for centuries. Each field is effectively a room with walls several feet thick and completely opaque. A tank advancing into a bocage field cannot see what is waiting on the other side of the next embankment. An infantry company can spend an entire day fighting across 2 fields. German defenders who understand the terrain use it with a patience and skill that erode the Allied advance to a pace measured not in miles, but in fields, one at a time, each one potentially containing the same machine gun that killed the men in the company ahead of you yesterday. The fighting in the Bocage through June and July is not what the strategic maps suggest when you look at them from a distance. The maps show a beachhead gradually expanding over weeks. Inside that expansion, at the level of the soldier moving through the hedgerows, the war is claustrophobic and personal and unrelenting. Companies lose half their strength across a week of this fighting and receive replacements who are thrown into positions they do not yet understand, beside veterans who have been changed by experiences too recent to explain. British and Canadian forces press toward Caen, a city that the D-Day planning designated as a first-day objective, and that instead takes until July 18th to capture in meaningful measure, after fighting that reduces significant portions of the city to rubble and costs both sides dearly. The battles around Caen, Operation Epsom, Operation Goodwood, The continuous pressure against the German armoured formations concentrated in that sector are not failures of execution in the simple sense. They are the mechanism by which German panzer reserves are held in the eastern part of the beachhead, while the American breakout builds in the west. Whether that is the plan, or the post facto explanation of what the plan produces, is an argument that military historians have conducted for decades. And this documentary takes a position on it in the detailed examination ahead. The American sector presses south and west through July, grinding towards Saint-Lô and the road network that opens the Cotentin Peninsula. The fighting costs the American formations heavily enough that replacement soldiers arrive at the front at rates that barely keep pace with losses. An armoured division burning through hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition during sustained offensive operations requires a supply system that stretches back to the Normandy beaches, and the beaches are receiving thousands of tons of cargo daily through the Mulberry artificial harbour at Arromanches and across the open sand where vehicles wade ashore from landing craft. The logistics of keeping the front moving are as consequential as the fighting at the front, and both are happening simultaneously under the same command pressure. Then, on July 25th, the character of the campaign changes in a morning. Operation Cobra opens with more than 1,500 heavy bombers dropping approximately 3,300 tons of explosives across a corridor several miles wide near Saint-Lô. The bombing is designed to obliterate German defensive positions in a concentrated area and open a gap that American armour can drive through before the German front can reconstitute. Some bombs fall short and kill approximately 111 American soldiers, including the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. The tragedy nearly stops the operation. It does not stop it. The Panzer Lehr division holding the bombed sector is effectively destroyed as a fighting force in the hours after the bombing. Its commander later describes the devastation in terms that make the battlefield sound like something that has ceased to resemble a military position and become instead a geography of shock and wreckage. American armour pushes through the gap before the German front can close it, and then the race begins. The Third Army under Patton becomes operational on August 1st, and the campaign that follows is unlike anything the Bocage fighting has prepared anyone to anticipate. Armoured columns drive south into Brittany, east across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, and then north in a sweeping arc that threatens to close behind the German forces still fighting in Normandy. The distances covered in days are the distances that took weeks in the hedgerows. A Sherman tank crew in those August advances inhabits a different war than the Bocage fighting produced. The tank moves continuously through French villages, where people stand in doorways watching the columns pass. The engine burns fuel at a rate that keeps the supply officers calculating deliveries around the clock, and the columns are already beginning to outpace the system feeding them. The Falaise Pocket forms in mid-August as the encirclement closes around two German armies. Roughly 100,000 German soldiers compress into a shrinking perimeter between American forces driving north and British-Canadian forces pressing south, with the gap between them narrowing daily under artillery fire and air attack. The roads inside the pocket become channels of wreckage, vehicles, horses, soldiers, equipment, as the escape corridor narrows and then closes. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers are captured when the pocket finally shuts. The rest are dead or have escaped east toward the Seine. The German army in France has not simply retreated. It has been structurally destroyed. The pursuit east toward Paris and the Seine burns through Allied fuel reserves at rates that force command decisions about which armies receive gasoline and which ones stop and wait. Third Army's armoured columns, which could drive further and faster than anything else on the front, begin stalling not from German resistance, but from empty fuel tanks. The fuel crisis of late August and September is the campaign's final major constraint, and the argument about how to manage it, between Eisenhower's broad front strategy and the proposals for a single concentrated thrust, is one of the most consequential command disputes in the Western campaign. Paris is liberated on August 25th. General Charles de Gaulle insists that French forces under General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division lead the entry into the city, and Eisenhower accepts the political logic of that arrangement, even as American columns are available to move faster. The Free French enter Paris first. De Gaulle walks down the Champs-Élysées the following day, through crowds whose emotional response to the city's liberation is documented in photographs that show something close to collective relief at a physical level. The release of 4 years of occupation compressed into a single afternoon. 80 days, from the beaches to Paris. Something I find genuinely striking when working through the operational documents from this campaign is how many times across those 80 days the outcome could have gone differently. The deception holding German reserves in place for the critical post-landing weeks. If it breaks early, the beachhead faces armoured divisions it cannot absorb. The Bocage fighting. If the American infantry cannot sustain the losses it takes clearing those hedgerows, the Breakout cannot build. The Falaise encirclement. If the gap stays open long enough, 2 German armies escape to reconstitute on the Seine, and the campaign extends by months. Each of those near misses is documented precisely enough that the contingency is real rather than theoretical. The campaign that succeeds is not the only one that was possible. If the quiet has settled around you now, and the details of this are doing what good history does when it has enough room, think about those 80 days not as a military operation, but as a human duration. The length of a summer. Long enough for a soldier who lands on June 6th to have fought through Normandy, broken out at Saint-Lô, raced across France in August heat, and stood somewhere outside Paris when the city came free. The same person, beginning and end, but with 80 days between them that nothing in their previous life prepared them for. This is the entire history of Operation Overlord. 80 days from D-Day to the liberation of Paris during the Second World War. A piece of paper in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, that most people have heard about, but almost nobody has actually read in full. It's not long. 11 lines, handwritten, on a small sheet of notepaper. Dwight Eisenhower wrote it on the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, folded it, and put it in his wallet. It begins. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. He went on to say that his decision to attack had been based on the best information available, that the troops, the air, and the navy had done all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. And then, in the final line, he wrote, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He signed it, he folded it, he never needed to read it aloud, but he wrote it, and that, I think, tells you more about the true nature of Operation Overlord than any triumphal account of its eventual success. This is not a story about a foregone conclusion. That framing, the Allied victory in Normandy as something inevitable, something mechanically destined to unfold, is a retrospective comfort that the historical record does not support. Eisenhower didn't write a failure statement because he was a pessimist. He wrote it because he was a professional, and professionals in his position understood with arithmetic clarity what was at stake. The weather was wrong. The intelligence was imperfect. The German defences were partially unknown, and the window, the meteorological gap that his chief weather officer, Group Captain James Stagg, had identified, was not a clear break in the storm. It was a barely survivable pause. Stagg was a Scottish civil servant meteorologist, not a military man, which is itself a remarkable circumstance when you consider what he was being asked to do. His diary entry for the 4th of June, 1944, records wind speeds at force 5 to 6 and sea state described as rough to very rough. His recommendation to Eisenhower was to delay, which is what happened. The next 24 hours produced a secondary low-pressure system moving northeast off the Azores, temporarily displacing the dominant Atlantic trough. Stagg identified this as a workable gap. The key word is workable. His forecast called for force 3 winds and 4 to 5 foot swells. The landing craft, vehicle and personnel, the flat-bottom Higgins boats that would carry infantry to the beaches, had a safe operating limit of 3-foot swells. Stagg was essentially telling the Supreme Allied Commander of the most complex military operation in history, the conditions will be marginally, narrowly survivable. Not good, survivable. Eisenhower's naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, kept a running diary throughout the war, and it's one of the more honest documents of the entire Normandy archive. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, wrote in his memoir published in 1956 that the Supreme Commander made the final go or no-go call at 04:15 on the 5th of June, quote, instantly and without visible hesitation. Butcher's diary tells a different story. He records Eisenhower sitting in silence for close to 5 minutes before he spoke. 5 minutes is not an instant. The difference matters because Smith's account was part of a deliberate post-war project to construct Eisenhower as the composed, unshakable commander. Butcher was writing in the room. His is the more reliable record. When you sit with both documents, as I have, the tension between them is not just a historiographical footnote. It reveals how quickly the mythology of decision-making begins to calcify around the actual, messier truth. The planning for Overlord had been consuming the Allied military machine for years before that night in Hampshire. The original Cossack plan, drawn up by the Office of the Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander in 1943, called for a 3-division assault. When Eisenhower and Montgomery reviewed it in early 1944, one of their few genuine moments of agreement was that 3 divisions was inadequate. They expanded it to 5. This added 2 beaches, required reorganizing the entire naval fire support plan, and demanded an additional 271 landing craft to be sourced from the Pacific Theater. The consequences of that decision rippled outward. It added 17 weeks to the preparation timeline. It delayed Pacific operations. It required moving 54.2 million ship tons of cargo across the Atlantic over 18 months, a tonnage figure that, as historian Richard Overy has calculated, exceeded the entire annual cargo throughput of the Port of New York in 1943. By the time Eisenhower folded his failure statement into his wallet, the sheer industrial and organizational weight of Overlord had made postponement to 1945 not just militarily unacceptable, but politically unthinkable. The Soviets were losing millions of men on the Eastern Front and demanding a second front. The political alliance was under strain, and German V-weapon sites in northern France were coming online with the capacity to bombard London on a scale that the buzz bombs of subsequent months would only hint at. There was a rehearsal. It's worth saying that plainly, because it complicates the triumphalist narrative considerably. On the 28th of April, 1944, off the coast of Devon at Slapton Sands, a stretch of coastline chosen for its resemblance to Utah Beach, a convoy of American tank landing ships was intercepted by German E-boats during Exercise Tiger. The resulting attack sank 2 vessels and killed 749 American servicemen. More American soldiers died in that rehearsal, in calm English waters, than would die on Utah Beach on D-Day itself. The Army classified this disaster until the 1980s. It didn't appear in Bradley's memoir. It didn't appear in Eisenhower's. The after-action report, held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, existed. The knowledge of what could go wrong existed. And when you hold that knowledge next to the 11 lines in Eisenhower's wallet, the failure statement stops looking like cautious professionalism. It starts looking like a man who had seen the rehearsal. On the evening of the 5th of June, Eisenhower drove to Greenham Common Airfield to walk among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division before they emplaned. His aide, Kay Summersby, recorded in her diary that he walked among them quietly, asking their names. He had signed the operational order. The losses forecast for the Airborne operation alone ran into the thousands. These were the faces attached to the forecasts. What Summersby's diary captures, without editorializing, is one of history's genuinely unbearable domestic scenes. A man who has made the decision, standing among the people that decision will consume. There are no speeches recorded from that walk, no inspirational addresses, just a general asking names. The German Meteorological Service independently assessed the 6th of June as unsuitable for an Allied landing. Their forecast for that window matched Stagg's data almost exactly, but they drew the opposite conclusion. The conditions were too poor to mount an operation of that scale. On the basis of that assessment, Field Marshal Rommel left Normandy on the 5th of June for a birthday visit to his wife in Herlingen, in southern Germany. He was roughly 600 miles from the beaches when the first American paratroopers jumped into the dark over the Cotentin Peninsula at 01:30 on the 6th of June. The German Weather Service was working from the same meteorological reality as Stagg. They got it wrong because they didn't believe the Allies would accept those conditions. Stagg knew they had no choice. When the paratroopers were in the air and the naval convoys were crossing the Channel, and the bombers were running their approach corridors over the French coast, Eisenhower returned to his quarters and waited. There is a photograph taken sometime that night, the exact hour is not recorded, that shows him alone at a desk, not reviewing documents, not on the telephone, just sitting. The wallet with the failure statement was in his jacket pocket. The morning would answer the question he couldn't answer himself. Every general in history who has crossed a threshold he cannot uncross has had some version of that night. What makes Eisenhower's version unique is the care with which he prepared his account of failure before he knew whether he needed it. The 6th of June came. The landings happened. The note stayed in the wallet. Eisenhower reportedly pulled it out by accident some weeks later, reread it, and almost discarded it. He didn't. It was discovered among his papers after the war, still folded. The man who planned the largest military operation in history kept his drafted confession of failure in his wallet for weeks afterward. I've read the letter many times now. What strikes me, every time, is not the stoicism of the language. It's how short it is. A man preparing for 150,000 casualties, for the weight of a decision that would determine the course of the 20th century, writes 11 lines. That economy of words is either extraordinary self-discipline or the only way a person can look directly at what they're about to do. 5 beaches, 5 different wars. There is a table in SHAEF Intelligence Summary number 26, dated the 18th of April, 1944, that I keep returning to whenever someone tells me the Normandy invasion was a single, unified operation. The table divides the 5 assault beaches by something called the Trafficability Index, a soil-bearing capacity measurement that determines what kinds of vehicles and loads a beach can support before the surface gives way. Utah Beach rates 4.2 on that index. Omaha Beach rates 2.1. That single number, 2.1, meant that any vehicle heavier than a light Jeep faced a serious risk of sinking into the sand before it reached the sea wall. The engineers knew this before the 6th of June. It was in the summary. It sat alongside casualty forecasts and tide tables and obstacle density estimates in folders that went to every senior commander in the theatre. The beaches weren't the same problem dressed in different sand. They were 5 distinct operational theatres, with different soil, different tides, different obstacle profiles, and different defenders. The Combined Intelligence Committee's documents make this explicit. Most documentaries don't. Utah Beach, on the right flank of the Allied assault, was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division, and on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, it landed in the wrong place. The combination of smoke from German fires, an unpredicted current, and the death of the officer aboard the navigation control vessel meant the first wave came ashore roughly 1,800 yards south of its designated sector. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the 26th President, the only general officer to land with the first wave on D-Day, and a man who had convinced his commanders to let him go by arguing he was too old to wait on a ship, conducted a personal reconnaissance on foot. Then he made a decision. His exact words, as recorded in the 4th Infantry Division War Diary, were, "We'll start the war from right here." The accidental landing point, it turned out, was substantially less heavily defended than the intended one. The navigation error saved lives. War does that occasionally, punishes the plan and rewards the accident. Omaha Beach is the part of D-Day that lives in cultural memory, and the after-action report of the 1st Infantry Division uses language so clinical it reads almost as a kind of mercy. The phrase, "assault element suffered severe attrition," appears where something like, "entire companies were destroyed in the first 15 minutes," would be more accurate. The official American military history, produced by Martin Blumenson over subsequent decades, puts first-wave casualties at Omaha at approximately 2,000. Later analysis of unit records, carried out by researchers with access to German documents unavailable to Blumenson, suggests a figure closer to 3,000 in the first 90 minutes. The discrepancy has never been formally resolved, partly because many of the unit morning reports that would settle the question were lost when the clerks who carried them were killed in the surf. The arithmetic of Omaha Beach is not a clean set of numbers. It's a set of numbers with bodies in the margin. Among the machines that were supposed to support the infantry at Omaha were 32 duplex-drive Sherman tanks, amphibious versions of the standard M4, fitted with a collapsible canvas screen that provided buoyancy and a propeller system for water movement. They were launched from their tank landing ships at approximately 5,000 yards offshore at 05:34 hours. 27 of them sank within minutes. Their canvas screens, designed to provide enough freeboard in relatively calm conditions, collapsed in the 3 to 4 foot swells. The crew of each lost tank had seconds to escape, in cold water, under fire, with no flotation beyond their own life preservers. At Utah Beach, the DD tanks were launched much closer to shore, within navigable range, and most survived. Same vehicle, same English Channel, different launch point. 5 miles of difference and 27 tank crews. What the Canadian sector, specifically Juno Beach, looked like on D-Day is something most American-centric accounts compress into a single supporting sentence. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed at Juno and, by the evening of the 6th of June, had advanced further inland than any other Allied division on D-Day. Not marginally further, substantially further. Their forward elements were within 3 miles of Caen, the city that the entire British sector would spend the next 47 days trying to capture. The 3rd Canadians' War Diary, held at Library and Archives Canada, records the halt not as a result of German resistance, but as a consequence of congestion on the beach itself. Follow-on forces pressing forward into a bottleneck that the division's own success had created. On the day that Allied forces came closest to Caen, they were stopped by their own momentum. Across the 3 British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the 50th Infantry Division, the 3rd Canadian, and the 3rd British were all fighting with enough separation from one another and from their American counterparts on the right flank that meaningful tactical coordination between sectors was, in practice, extremely limited. The gap between Sword Beach on the left and Omaha on the right was over 30 kilometers. In that gap, airborne forces were scattered across miles of Norman countryside, trying to find each other in the dark. The 82nd Airborne Division's after-action report notes that only 2,500 of the division's 6,400 jumpers landed within 1 mile of their designated drop zones. The rest was somewhere in a 25-mile radius, reorganizing under fire or making their own tactical decisions with whatever men and weapons they could find. The airborne scatter was a consequence of a chain of failures that the after-action reports handle with considerable restraint. Anti-aircraft fire forced many transport aircraft to take evasive action, breaking formation and throwing off navigation. Some aircraft, hit by flak, dropped paratroopers into the English Channel. Others dropped men 40 miles from their intended zones. The effect on the ground was simultaneously disastrous by the plan's standards and, in certain places, accidentally useful. Scattered paratroopers in small improvised groups denied the Germans a clear picture of where the main airborne effort was directed. German commanders spent the early hours of the 6th of June trying to piece together an airborne order of battle that didn't correspond to any recognizable pattern, because there wasn't one. Chaos, in this specific instance, created its own form of deception. The primary reason Omaha Beach became a near catastrophe, and very nearly a full catastrophe, was not in the SHAEF intelligence summary. The 2100 Trafficability Index was known. What was not known, or more precisely what was known and not properly distributed, was that the 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the Omaha sector approximately 6 weeks before D-Day. This was a full-strength, combat-hardened division redeployed from the Eastern Front, not the static garrison force that the intelligence summary predicted. A ultra-decrypt had captured signals suggesting this redeployment. The information existed in the system. It was not integrated into the beach defense assessment that reached the planning level for the first wave. The men of the 29th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division landed against a force significantly stronger than the one on their maps. By the end of the 6th of June, the Allied forces had put approximately 107,000 soldiers, 14,000 vehicles, and 14,500 tons of supplies onto the beaches. Against the original plan, which had called for 176,475 men on D-Day alone, the shortfall of roughly 69,000 soldiers was almost entirely the product of Omaha Beach's paralysis. 6 hours during which the beach was functionally closed and the landing schedule collapsed. That deficit didn't disappear. It moved forward through the campaign like a debt, shaping supply timelines and reinforcement schedules for weeks afterward. What the operational summary for D-Day actually describes, when you read it with all 5 sectors in view, is 5 separate battles that happened to share a date and a coastline. They were won or lost on wildly different terms. Utah was won partly by a navigational error. Juno was won by Canadian soldiers who got further than anyone and were stopped by their own success. Omaha was nearly lost because of an intelligence failure that sat in a decode nobody properly read. The 5 beaches were not a unified operation. They were a collection of simultaneous crises, some of which resolved themselves in the Allies' favor, some of which nearly didn't. That the whole thing cohered into a functioning beachhead by nightfall on the 6th of June is not a testament to perfect planning. It is, in many respects, a testament to what happens when you put enough men and material into motion that even the failures can't stop the overall momentum. Rommel's theory and the argument that split German high command. There is a memorandum in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, written on the 31st of January 1944, that represents one of the more precise acts of military prophecy in the archive of the Second World War. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, newly appointed to command Army Group B, wrote to the OKW, the German Supreme Command, the following: "The enemy is at his weakest and most vulnerable at the moment of landing. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, for the Allies as well as for Germany. For the Allies, it will be the longest day. For Germany, it will be the last hope. He was right about the 24 hours. He was right about the moment of maximum Allied vulnerability. He was right that the Panzer reserves needed to be positioned close to the coast. And he was overruled by a command structure that chose to make a different decision, for reasons that had more to do with the relationship between Hitler and his generals than with any coherent reading of the strategic situation. The argument about where to position the Panzer reserves was not a minor tactical debate. It was the central question of German defensive doctrine for the Atlantic Wall, and it split two of Germany's most capable commanders across an irreconcilable difference. Rommel's position was straightforward. Position all armoured reserves within roughly 30 kilometres of the coast, close enough to launch a counterattack within hours of a landing, before Allied air power could achieve dominance over the battlefield. Any delay, he argued, would allow the Allies to consolidate a beachhead, bring up reinforcements, and make the eventual counterattack increasingly costly and ultimately futile. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, took the opposite view. Hold the panzer divisions back, 100 kilometers or more inland, out of range of Allied naval guns, and commit them in a concentrated mass once the landing site had been confirmed. He was applying the classical doctrine of the mobile reserve, and his logic was not without merit. The problem was that the Allied air forces in the spring of 1944 were not a factor that classical doctrine had ever accounted for. Hitler's solution to this disagreement was the worst possible outcome of a dispute between two competent men. He split the panzer forces between both positions. Forward elements distributed along the coast per Rommel's argument, deep reserves held inland per von Schweppenberg's, and then retained personal control over the strategic reserve. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, and Panzer Lehr, three of the most capable armoured formations in France, could not be committed by any field commander without Hitler's direct authorization. The OKW War Diary records this arrangement with bureaucratic precision. What it doesn't record, what no official document could record, is the obvious absurdity of organizing the defense of an entire theater around the availability of one man's attention at a moment of crisis. On the morning of the 6th of June, that absurdity expressed itself in the most consequential possible way. Rommel was in Bavaria. Hitler was asleep. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr sat in their assembly areas, waiting for authorization to move. The OKW operations log for the 6th of June shows the first awareness of the Allied landings reaching senior staff shortly after midnight. Hitler was not informed until after 10 o'clock in the morning, because his staff, by established practice, did not wake him for morning briefings before noon. The authorization to release the panzer reserves came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By that time, the Allied beachhead had been continuous for approximately 10 hours. The paratroopers had been on the ground for more than 12. The window that Rommel's doctrine was designed to exploit had been closed for most of the day. The only panzer division actually positioned in the Normandy area on D-Day was the 21st Panzer Division, and its story is one of the campaign's more extraordinary small dramas. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, had spent the early morning hours of the 6th of June in Paris. He could not be reached. His division spent the critical early hours without orders, and when Feuchtinger finally returned and launched a counterattack toward the beaches in the late afternoon, his tanks briefly reached the sea at Lyon-sur-Mer, the only German armoured force to touch the coastline on D-Day. The after-action report that Feuchtinger wrote while in Allied captivity in 1945 omits his location in the early morning hours entirely. That omission is its own kind of document. against the roughly 320 sorties the Luftwaffe managed to fly over the invasion area on the 6th of June, of which approximately 36 made direct contact with the beachhead, the Allied air forces flew approximately 10,000 sorties. A German pilot, Hans Strehlow, whose log is held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, recorded his experience of that day in 9 words. Crossed coast, numerous enemy aircraft, turned back. That entry is not a coward's account. It's an accurate operational report. Going forward meant certain loss against odds that no aircraft in any air force on Earth could have overcome. The Luftwaffe's contribution to D-Day consisted largely of turning around. That's not an editorial judgment. It's what the flight logs say. Basil Liddell-Hart conducted extensive interviews with captured German commanders in 1945 and 46, and his subsequent book, The Other Side of the Hill, published in 1948, presents the Panzer Reserve dispute as a straightforward case of Hitler's interference wrecking Rommel's sound defensive plan. The more recent operational analysis, particularly the work of Stephen Badsey, complicates this reading. Badsey argues that even with all Panzer Reserves positioned forward, the naval gunfire support available to the Allies on D-Day would have been catastrophic for any massed armoured approach to the beaches. The battleship HMS Warspite alone could fire an 1,800-pound shell every 30 seconds to a range of 18 miles. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers were in the Naval Fire Support Force on the 6th of June. They collectively fired approximately 20,000 tons of ordnance in the first 48 hours. Any panzer division advancing through a 15-mile coastal strip under that weight of fire would have sustained extraordinary losses. The honest conclusion is probably somewhere between Rommel and Badsey. Forward panzers would have inflicted far heavier Allied casualties, perhaps fatally heavier on certain beaches, but stopping the landing altogether was likely beyond what any ground force could achieve against that weight of fire and air cover. Rommel's personal diary entry for the evening of the 5th of June contains a line that deserves its own moment of consideration. He wrote that there were no reports of unusual enemy naval activity and that the weather was too poor for a landing. He had concluded, on the basis of the same meteorological data that Stagg was reading in Hampshire, that the window was closed. He was wrong in exactly the same way the German Weather Service was wrong, and for exactly the same reason. Neither believed the Allies would accept those conditions. It was a rational assessment. The problem is that rational assessments of what a rational opponent will accept are dangerous against an opponent who has already concluded that the cost of waiting is higher than the cost of going. Me, looking at the full German command picture for the 6th of June, Rommel in Bavaria, Hitler asleep, Feuchtinger in Paris, the Panzer Reserves frozen in their assembly areas. I'm struck not by incompetence, but by the particular failure mode of a highly centralized, authoritarian command structure. Every decision required someone at the top of a very specific chain to be reachable, informed, and willing to act. On the most consequential morning of the war in the West, none of those conditions were simultaneously true. The Wehrmacht was, in many individual respects, a superbly professional military force, and it was organized in a way that guaranteed its professionalism couldn't function on the 6th of June. The fundamental lesson of the German command failure at Normandy is not tactical, it's structural. A command system organized around one man's personal authorization becomes only as fast, as clear, and as rational as that one man at his worst moment. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, Hitler's worst moment was simply being asleep. That was enough. What the hedgerows did to the map. There is a letter in the archives of the Virginia Military Institute, written by a private in the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division, to his mother in Roanoke, Virginia. The letter passed the army censors because it contained no specific military information. It was written approximately a week after D-Day, from somewhere in the Norman interior. The private wrote, "Mama, the maps they gave us don't mean anything here. The Germans can hear you moving before you can see them. Every field has 4 walls and only one way out, and they know which way that is. I don't know how we're supposed to go forward." He wasn't complaining. He wasn't breaking. He was doing something more precise than that. He was describing, with the accuracy of a man who has spent a week trying to stay alive in a specific type of terrain, exactly what was wrong with every tactical assumption the United States Army had made about the Norman interior. The Bocage is a Norman French word for wooded country, and in the agricultural geography of inland Normandy, it describes a system of small fields, averaging roughly 200 by 300 yards in area, each surrounded by earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, topped with root-anchored hedgerows that in many cases were several centuries old. The banks weren't decorative, they were structural, built up over generations to drain the clay soil and create windbreaks for livestock. They were also, by the summer of 1944, about as good a defensive position as any military engineer could design for a determined infantry holding off a mechanized force. They provided cover, concealment, natural firing positions, and a 3-dimensional maze that rendered almost every map at the company level functionally useless after roughly 200 yards. When an M4 Sherman tank attempted to cross one of these banks, which was the obvious solution to the obstacle, since the banks were the walls of the problem, the tank had to climb. As it climbed, the front of the hull rose and the belly of the tank was exposed. And on the other side of the bank, German anti-tank gunners had pre-registered their weapons on that exact angle of exposure. They didn't need to find the tank. They just needed to wait for it to come over. The 241st Tank Battalion's after-action report describes this dynamic with the particular exhaustion of men who've encountered the same ambush geometry repeatedly. The tank that was the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal was being defeated, again and again, by a medieval agricultural boundary. The 38th Infantry Division entered the Bocage on the 15th of June, 1944, and suffered 3,934 casualties in its first 18 days of action. That's an average of 219 men per day, a rate that, as military historian Carlo d'Este has noted, was comparable to the worst attritional fighting on the Eastern Front. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, describes the Bocage as slow and difficult. The unit records describe something considerably worse. Both documents are accurate in their own register, which is part of what makes reading the memoir alongside the divisional diary such an uncomfortable exercise. The general's view and the infantry's view of the same event often look like 2 different wars. In the Bocage, they were. Ammunition consumption tells part of the story that casualty rates don't fully capture. By the 30th of June, just 24 days after D-Day, the First Army had consumed 95,738 tons of ammunition in the Bocage fighting, an average of roughly 3,989 tons per day. The logistical plan had allocated 2,500 tons per day for this same period, based on expected rates of advance and anticipated fighting conditions. The Bocage was consuming 60% more ammunition than planned, because static defensive fighting eats ordnance at a fundamentally different rate than mobile warfare. That deficit, 60% above plan, day after day, moved forward through the supply chain like a slow flood, raising the waterline against every other requirement. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron didn't write a memorandum. He didn't file a patent application. He took a piece of scrap steel from a demolished German beach obstacle, welded it into a set of forward-facing prongs, altered the assembly to the front hull of a Sherman tank, drove the tank directly into a hedgerow bank, and watched the prongs cut through the root mat instead of climbing over it. The tank went through the bank at ground level, hull down, belly armor protected, with the element of surprise preserved. When General Bradley was shown the prototype in early July, he ordered 500 fitted within days. The cutting device, welded from the discarded metal of the enemy's own beach defenses, became known as the Rhinoceros. It was the solution to a tactical crisis that had pinned the American advance for weeks, and it came not from a weapons laboratory or an engineering corps, but from one man's observation of what the tanks were doing wrong. The ambush geometry of the Bocage had a terrifying standardization to it once you understand the German defensive doctrine being applied. A single MG-42 machine gun team, 2 men with 1 weapon, would be positioned in a prepared firing position at a hedgerow corner, with a pre-registered field of fire covering the gate or the low point in the far bank, the only likely entry point for infantry moving across the field. The squad's riflemen provided close protection for the gun team. When an American squad moved through the gate, it was channeled directly into the gun's arc. The MG-42 fired at approximately 1,200 rounds per minute. At that rate, the first burst across a 30-yard field entrance was not a warning. When the gun team had exhausted its belted ammunition or sensed incoming artillery, it withdrew through a prepared tunnel in the bank. The sequence, entry, ambush, withdrawal, was repeatable, and it was repeated hundreds of times across the Norman interior in June and July. The terrifying thing about it wasn't its complexity, it was its simplicity. What I find genuinely difficult to accept, even now, having read the pre-invasion intelligence documents and the training records alongside the Bocage after-action reports, is how completely the hedgerow terrain had been available to be known before the 6th of June. The Bocage appeared in pre-invasion aerial reconnaissance photographs. Schaeff's photo interpreters noted it in a summary as an enclosed field system, trafficability uncertain. That annotation was in the intelligence document. What it was not in was the infantry training syllabus. American soldiers spent 3 years training on the open terrain of England, Scotland, and the American South. Not a single dedicated Bocage combat training program was conducted before D-Day. The problem was identified. The response was silence. By mid-July, the cumulative effect of 6 weeks in the Bocage had produced something that goes beyond casualty statistics and ammunition counts. It had produced, at the company and battalion level, a kind of tactical cognitive compression. Officers stopped planning 3 moves ahead, because planning 3 moves ahead required seeing 3 moves ahead, and in the Bocage, nobody could see more than 1 field in any direction. The after-action reports from this period, and I've read a great many of them, are notable for what they don't contain. They record what happened. They rarely record what was intended. The gap between intention and outcome had become so routine that it stopped being worth documenting. The Bocage was also doing something to the timeline that nobody in the planning documents had fully reckoned with. Every day in those fields was a day that supply dumps were being consumed at 60% above plan. A day that German divisions opposite the American sector were being replaced by fresh units from the strategic reserve. And a day that the narrow window in which Allied operational surprise still held value was narrowing further. The private's letter to his mother in Roanoke described a tactical reality. The logistical documents described a strategic problem. They were the same problem, seen from 2 different altitudes. Solving it would require not just the Rhinoceros device, and not just more artillery. It would require something large enough and violent enough to break the entire line at once. That was coming, but the Bocage would have to be paid for first. The floating port, engineering the impossible supply chain. There is a sentence in War Office Technical Note TN/Mulberry/44/7, dated September of 1943, that stops me every time I return to it. The note was written by British engineers in the early planning stage of the Mulberry Harbour project, and it reads, A harbour of this nature has never before been constructed or deployed. The engineering tolerances are, in all respects, beyond current peacetime standards of practice. We are, in the most literal sense, building something that has never existed. This document is not classified. It was never classified. It sat in the Royal Engineers Archive for decades, accessible to anyone who went looking. What it describes is the single most audacious piece of military engineering in the history of combined operations. 2 complete artificial harbours, designed in total secrecy, built in under 12 months, and towed across the most treacherous stretch of water in the Northern Hemisphere. The concept had multiple origins, as most genuine innovations do. The core problem was simple and devastating. Without a major port, the Allied forces landing in Normandy could not sustain themselves. Cherbourg, the nearest substantial harbour, was certain to be heavily defended and likely to be demolished before capture. The beach discharge rates for the Higgins boats and smaller craft were insufficient to sustain an army of the size Overlord required. The Cossack planners knew this from the beginning. What Captain J.D. Hughes of the Royal Engineers proposed in a 1942 memorandum, and what was developed into the Mulberry concept through the following year, was to bring the harbour with you. Manufacture it in England, tow it across, sink it into position. The elegance of the idea and the engineering madness required to execute it coexisted without apparent contradiction in the minds of the people who built it. The Mulberry system consisted of 4 distinct components, each solving a specific part of the harbour problem. The bombardons were steel cruciform floating structures, anchored in the outer approach to absorb wave energy before it reached the inner harbour. The Phoenix caissons were hollow, reinforced concrete boxes, the largest of them approximately 60 metres in length and as tall as a 6-storey building, designed to be towed to position, flooded, and sunk to the seabed to form a continuous breakwater. The whale roadways were articulated steel pontoon bridges, flexible enough to rise and fall with the tide, connecting the deep-water pierheads to the shore. The spud pierheads were elevated platforms on steel legs that could be jacked up or down as the tide moved, providing stable loading platforms for ships regardless of the tidal range, which in Normandy ran to roughly 6 meters between high and low water. Together, these 4 elements created a harbour where there had been open sea. The total weight of components for both harbours was approximately 1.5 million tons of steel and concrete. The entire apparatus had to be manufactured without the Germans knowing what it was. The Phoenix caissons were the most demanding single element of the system, and the story of how they were hidden during construction is one of the more inventive pieces of operational deception in the entire Overlord plan. They were built in dry docks and river berths from Scotland to Cornwall, enormous concrete boxes that could not possibly be concealed from Luftwaffe reconnaissance overflights if they were left sitting on a slipway. The solution was to deliberately partially flood them and sink them in shallow coastal water, where they looked from the air like submerged obstacles or anti-invasion barricades. German intelligence analysts identified unusual concrete structures in their aerial photograph assessments and classified them as shore defense installations. The objects that would become the breakwaters of the Allied supply chain were hiding in plain sight as the enemy's own defensive furniture. The engineering tolerances required for a Phoenix caisson were at, and in some respects beyond, the limits of what British structural engineering could calculate with slide rules in 1943. Each unit had to be light enough to be towed by a single ocean-going tug at a maximum speed of 4 knots. Faster movement caused dangerous yaw that risked flooding the unit in transit, while being structurally strong enough to withstand lateral wave forces of up to 15 tons per square meter once sunk. The solution was a variable concrete thickness, thinner at the base, where hydrostatic pressure from the surrounding water provided structural assistance, thicker at the waterline, where wave impact was greatest. This was not intuitive engineering. It required a precise understanding of the distribution of hydrodynamic forces that the designers worked out on paper, without the possibility of a full-scale prototype test, under a security regime that prevented them from consulting outside specialists. Both harbours were assembled in 12 days, following the 6th of June. The construction crews worked 24-hour shifts in open water, positioning Phoenix units in sequence to build a continuous breakwater, while the bombardons were anchored in the outer approach, and the whale roadway sections were connected to the spud pierheads. Mulberry A, the American harbour off Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B, the British harbour at Arromanches on Gold Beach, were assembled simultaneously by Royal Engineer construction units, whose experience of open water harbour construction under combat conditions was by definition zero. Nobody had done this before. The technical note had been correct about that. Then the storm came. On the 19th of June, 1944, the English Channel produced a Force 6 storm with sustained winds and 8-foot swells. The worst June Channel storm in 40 years, by the assessment of the Royal Navy's meteorological records. Mulberry A took the worst of it. Unanchored sections of whale roadway broke loose and drove into Phoenix units that hadn't yet been fully sunk and pinned. Within 48 hours, approximately 800 vessels of various types had been beached or damaged. The floating roadway sections had broken apart, and several Phoenix caissons had been driven onto the beach by the same seas they were supposed to resist. By the 21st of June, Mulberry A was functionally destroyed. The harbour that had been designed to deliver 5,000 tons of supplies per day had, in its brief operational existence before the storm, landed approximately 9,008 tons over 13 days, roughly 150 tons per day, against a design capacity 40 times higher. The harbour designed to sustain an army had barely functioned before the sea took it. The decision to abandon Mulberry A rather than rebuild it is one of those command decisions where the archival record runs in 3 different directions simultaneously. The official Army engineer history attributes the decision to General John C. H. Lee, commanding the communications zone. Eisenhower's aide Butcher's diary records the decision as Eisenhower's own, following a personal inspection of the storm damage on the 23rd of June. Rear Admiral John Hall's account suggests the Army asked the Navy to assess salvageability, and the Navy recommended abandonment. All 3 accounts may capture part of a decision that was reached through an informal process that no single participant later wanted full ownership of. Butcher's contemporaneous diary is probably the most reliable single source, but it's worth noting that even Butcher may have been told what to record, rather than writing what he witnessed. In the mess of the post-storm assessment, with hundreds of damaged vessels to account for, and a supply crisis deepening by the day, the paper trail is genuinely incomplete. Mulberry B at Arromanches survived the storm in substantially better condition, partly because of a slightly more sheltered approach, and partly because more of its Phoenix units had been fully sunk and stabilized before the weather hit. The decision to cannibalize the wrecked components of Mulberry A to reinforce Mulberry B was operationally sound and was implemented within days. Port Winston, the name given to Mulberry B, eventually reached and exceeded its design capacity, achieving a peak delivery of 11,000 tons in a single day in August of 1944. Over the entire campaign, Port Winston handled approximately 2.5 million tons of cargo, 500,000 vehicles, and 2.5 million men. That is not a marginal contribution to the logistics of liberation. That is the logistics of liberation. The steel in the whale floating roadways, the articulated pontoon bridges that connected ships to shore, came partly from dismantled railway branch lines in England. Between 1943 and 44, the War Office requisitioned and melted down approximately 160 miles of rural British railway track, branch lines in Devon, Somerset, and Wales to manufacture the roadway sections. Villagers whose train services disappeared during this period were told only that the material was needed for the war effort. No further explanation was given. Some of those branch lines never reopened. The roads to Paris were built partly from the bones of English country stations, and nobody was ever quite told which ones. Caen, the city Montgomery could not explain. The diary of Marie-Louise Osmont begins before the war, in the life of a woman living in the farmland north of Caen, in the Perrières-sur-le-Dan area. It becomes, by the summer of 1944, one of the most important civilian accounts of the Normandy campaign, not because Osmont was a soldier or a strategist, but because she was present, continuously, through the entire battle for the city, sheltering in her home while the Allied and German forces fought across her fields and those of her neighbours. Her entry for the 7th of June reads, "The cannon is constant, without interruption, without let-up. The house shudders. I have put the animals in the cellar. The cows are bellowing. I think about the people in Caen. What can be happening there?" What was happening in Caen on the 7th of June was that it had already been bombed. RAF Bomber Command had struck the city on D-Day itself, killing an estimated 800 civilians in a raid designed to block road junctions and prevent German reinforcement. The city that the British operational plan listed as a D-Day objective was being destroyed by the force that was supposed to reach it by nightfall. Montgomery's 21st Army Group operational order for the 6th of June, 1944, is held at the National Archives at Kew. The document uses the phrase, "capture on D-Day," in reference to Caen. This is not ambiguous language. When British and Canadian forces failed to reach the city on D-Day evening, stopped by the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack and by the congestion on Sword Beach, Montgomery began a process of reinterpretation that would occupy him for the rest of the campaign and, in some respects, for the rest of his life. By the time his memoirs were published in 1958, Caen had become not a D-Day objective that was missed, but an aspiration within a larger strategic design. The operational order says what it says. The memoir says something different. I've read both documents. They're describing different versions of the same intention, and one of them was written 14 years after the fact. The Caen fighting between D-Day and the city's eventual partial capture on the 9th of July involved 4 major British and Canadian offensive operations: Perch, Epsom, Charnwood, and Goodwood, each of which consumed substantial forces, generated substantial casualties, and failed to capture the city within the time frame its commanders projected. The standard defence of this record, articulated most clearly by historian John Keegan and later by John Buckley, is that the British operations on the eastern flank were drawing German armour toward Caen and away from the American sector, creating the conditions for the eventual American breakout. This is probably true operationally. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, and eventually 9 of the 12 German Panzer Divisions in France were committed opposite the British and Canadian sectors. Patton's Third Army, when unleashed in late July, drove through a sector where the German armour was thin precisely because it was thick in front of Caen. The strategic logic holds. What the strategic logic doesn't resolve is the cost borne by the French civilians who lived in and around the city while this logic was being implemented. Between the 6th of June and the 18th of July, Allied aircraft dropped approximately 14,000 tons of bombs over Caen and its surroundings. A research thesis submitted to the DTIC in 2020, examining the Caen bombing campaign specifically, calculates that Allied air forces killed approximately as many French civilians in the Normandy bombing campaign as German forces killed Allied soldiers in the same period. This is a comparison that appears in almost no popular history of Operation Overlord. It's in the archive. It's in the targeting documents at TNA Air 37. It's in the municipal records at the Archives Départementales du Calvados. The decision to bomb Caen's road network on D-Day was made with knowledge of the civilian population density. The decision was approved. The civilian cost was accepted as proportionate to the military requirement. Whether that assessment was correct is a question the documents raise and don't answer. Operation Goodwood, launched on the 18th of July, was Montgomery's largest single armoured operation of the Normandy campaign. 3 British armoured divisions, approximately 1,100 tanks, were preceded by the largest tactical air bombardment in history to that point. 2,100 aircraft dropped approximately 7,700 tons of bombs on German positions south of Caen over the course of the preparatory phase. The armoured advance that followed gained approximately 11 kilometres before being stopped by the layered anti-tank defensive system of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. British tank losses: 413 destroyed or damaged. The advance fell well short of Falaise, the stated operational objective. Montgomery subsequently argued that Goodwood had never been intended to reach Falaise, that it was a limited objective operation designed to draw out German armour and wear it down. His critics, including Eisenhower's Chief of Staff Bedell Smith and SHAEF's intelligence chief Kenneth Strong, were furious. The post-operational correspondence between SHAEF and 21st Army Group in late July, held at Kew, is noticeably terse in both directions. The German defensive system that absorbed Goodwood's armoured punch was a deliberately engineered response to Allied tactical patterns. First Corps of the 1st SS Panzer Corps had identified, through observation of previous Allied attacks, that armoured operations were invariably preceded by heavy bombing. They built their defence in 3 distinct layers: a forward sacrifice line designed to absorb the bombing and appear to be the main position, a main defensive line 2 to 3 kilometres behind it, outside typical bombing accuracy margins, and a deep anti-tank gun belt at 6 to 8 kilometres, using 88mm flak guns employed in the ground role. The 88mm gun, firing a 10-kilogram projectile at approximately 820 meters per second, could penetrate 120 millimeters of homogeneous armor at a range of 1,000 meters, exceeding the frontal armor protection of every British tank deployed at Goodwood. The German defense adapted to Allied bombing doctrine faster than Allied commanders adapted their tactics to the German defense. That is a hard sentence to write about men who were fighting on the right side, but it's what the operational record supports. When British and Canadian forces entered the northern half of Caen on the 9th of July, they found a city in which approximately 3/4 of the pre-war built environment had been destroyed. The population had fallen from 60,000 to approximately 25,000, with the remainder sheltering in the limestone quarries on the city's outskirts and in makeshift spaces beneath rubble. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division War Diary records the entry into the city with a single sentence: "Advance continued as planned." Marie-Louise Osmont, writing from her damaged farmhouse north of the city, recorded, "The soldiers came. They were boys. They seemed lost among the rubble." Both descriptions are accurate. Neither is complete without the other. The medieval Abbaye aux Hommes, the Abbey of the Men, built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, survived the destruction of Caen largely intact because of an act of administrative courage by the city's chief archivist, Henri Remeniérat. Remeniérat negotiated with German officers during the early phase of the bombardment to have the abbey and its grounds declared a protected site under the Geneva Convention. Approximately 10,000 civilians survived in and around its walls through the worst of the fighting. The archive of Remeniérat's negotiations is held at the Archives départementales du Calvados. It is a document about one person's decision to use bureaucratic procedure as a form of protection, in the middle of industrial-scale destruction, and to actually make it work. It's one of the most quietly remarkable things in the Normandy archive, and it appears in virtually no account of the battle. The total civilian death toll in Caen and its immediate surroundings over the course of the battle ran to approximately 3,000 people killed directly by bombardment or combat, with thousands more wounded. The pre-war population of a city in a Norman agricultural region. The city itself, as a physical entity, the streets and churches and market squares and houses that had accumulated over 8 centuries, was largely gone by the time the southern half fell on the 18th of July. The logistical and military case for the bombardment of Caen was real. The cost in French civilian lives was also real. In the post-war decades, France rebuilt Caen with Marshall Plan funds and reconstruction grants, and the rebuilt city opened a memorial museum, the Mémorial de Caen, that addresses both the liberation and the destruction, with an honesty that is somewhat unusual in national war commemoration. The museum asks its visitors to hold both things at the same time. That's harder than it sounds, and it's the right approach. The ultra-secret, when Bletchley Park watched the German army die. There is a document in the TNAHW1 series at the National Archives at Kew, an ultra-intelligence summary carrying the reference designation Z/TGNI/493, dated the 3rd of July, 1944, that contains a single paragraph which, when you understand what you're reading, changes the entire character of the Normandy campaign. The paragraph summarizes the content of an intercepted German 7th Army supply report. The report notes that available ammunition stocks for panzer formations in the Caen sector had fallen to approximately 40% of minimum combat requirement. This document was on Eisenhower's desk, in summarized form, within 36 hours of being transmitted by German signals. Eisenhower knew, on or around the 5th of July, that the German panzer divisions opposite Caen were running critically short of ammunition. Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood on the 18th of July, 13 days later. That gap is not laziness, and it's not a strategic mystery. But understanding it requires understanding what was happening every day in the wooden huts of a country estate in Buckinghamshire. Bletchley Park in the summer of 1944 was the most consequential intelligence operation in the history of warfare, and it functioned through a combination of mathematical brilliance, industrial scale, and a secrecy so complete that it would not be publicly acknowledged for another 30 years. The German military encrypted its communications using the Enigma machine, an electromechanical rotor device whose theoretical key space ran to approximately 158 quintillion possible settings. That number was not a barrier to confidence. It was confidence itself. German operators who used the Enigma daily were working on the explicit understanding, validated by their own cryptanalysts, that the machine was unbreakable in any operationally relevant timeframe. They were wrong. The British knew it. And maintaining the secret that they knew it was, arguably, as demanding a task as the cryptanalysis itself. The mathematics of breaking Enigma rested on a specific vulnerability. The machine, by its design, could never encrypt a letter as itself. If you press the letter A on the keyboard, A could appear as any letter in the alphabet except A. This seems like a minor quirk. It was, in fact, a fatal structural flaw, because it meant that when British analysts tested a known plaintext word, a crib, typically a phrase that appeared in stereotyped German message openings, against an intercepted ciphertext, any position in which a crib letter matched the ciphertext letter could be immediately eliminated. The electromechanical bomb machines, designed largely by Alan Turing, automated this elimination process across all possible Enigma starting configurations at speeds no human team could match. By the summer of 1944, approximately 200 bomb machines were running continuously at Bletchley and its outstations, breaking the Enigma traffic for the Normandy theatre with a latency, from German transmission to Allied intelligence summary, of between 12 and 72 hours. The Germans were writing their operational orders in the morning, and the Allies were reading them by evening. The historian F. H. Hinsley, who served at Bletchley Park and later wrote the official history of British intelligence in the Second World War, is meticulous in the volumes he produced for HMSO in the 1980s about what Ultra could and couldn't do. It could provide order of battle, the locations, strengths, and intentions of German units, with a reliability and currency that no other intelligence source approached. What it couldn't always do was provide the granular tactical detail that battalion and company commanders needed. The strategic picture at Allied Corps and Army level was, from mid-June onward, substantially clearer to the Allied command than to any German formation commander, because the Allied command was reading German command traffic, and the German command was not reading Allied command traffic. Historians still occasionally describe the Normandy campaign as a battle fought in the fog of war. For the senior Allied commanders, with access to Ultra, the fog was considerably thinner on one side than the other. The most consequential failure of the Ultra program in the entire Normandy campaign was not a decryption failure. It was an assessment failure. A decrypt from April of 1944 captured signals that, properly interpreted, indicated the movements of the 352nd Infantry Division toward the Omaha Beach sector, the full-strength combat-experienced division whose presence on the 6th of June turned a difficult landing into a near catastrophe. The signal existed. The information was in the system. Hinsley's official history acknowledges the intercept while describing its content as ambiguous. Historian Ralph Bennett, in his detailed study, Ultra in the West, published in 1979, makes a less charitable assessment. The intercept was processed incorrectly, and its implications were not followed up with the beach defense intelligence teams who needed the information. The 749 men who died at Exercise Tiger had already demonstrated what unexpectedly strong opposition at the waterline could do. The 352nd's presence at Omaha was not Exercise Tiger. It was the real thing, at full scale, on the most exposed beach of the entire invasion, against men who had been told to expect a static garrison. From D-Day onward, the Ultra picture of German dispositions in France was, by the standard of any previous military intelligence operation in history, extraordinary. SHAEF could track the locations of every panzer division in France with an average accuracy of roughly 24 hours. They could watch German formations being destroyed, reinforced, transferred, and reconstituted in near real time. They could read the German logistics reports, the ammunition returns, the fuel states, the casualty totals, that told them not just where the German army was, but how badly it was bleeding. The supply report intercepted on the 3rd of July, showing panzer ammunition at 40% of minimum requirement, was one signal among hundreds. By early August, when the Mortain counterattack was being planned by Hitler's direct order, the Ultra intercepts of the German command traffic gave Bradley more than 24 hours of warning about the axis of attack and the panzer divisions assigned. This is documented in the SHAEF intelligence summaries held at the National Archives. The question of exactly how much of that warning reached the infantry holding the critical high ground is not as cleanly answered. There is a dimension of the Ultra story that the official history handles carefully, and that I think deserves direct statement. To use intelligence derived from Ultra, Allied commanders sometimes had to construct alternative explanations for decisions made on the basis of information they couldn't acknowledge. If a formation was moved to a specific location because Ultra had revealed a German intent, the movement order had to be justified through visible reconnaissance or prisoner interrogation, rather than by its real cause. The discipline required to maintain this over months of intensive operations, across a headquarters of thousands of people with varying levels of Ultra access, was extraordinary. It also created records that are, in certain places, deliberately misleading. After-action reports and operational orders that explain decisions through secondary sources because the primary source had to remain hidden. The Normandy Operational Archive is, in these places, a document constructed for two audiences simultaneously. The contemporaneous reader who couldn't know what it omitted, and the future historian, who would eventually know exactly what it left out. The electrical consumption of Bletchley Park's operation in 1944 ran to approximately 2.8 million kilowatt-hours annually, roughly equivalent to powering a town of 20,000 people. Each of the approximately 200 bomb machines contained 36 rotating drum units and drew around 8 kilowatts continuously. This was a substantial industrial enterprise, disguised as a country estate, employing approximately 10,000 people at its peak, of whom a significant proportion were women, primarily recruited from universities through a process that bypassed most of the normal military enlistment channels, because the skills required were mathematical and linguistic rather than physical. The women of Bletchley Park decoded the traffic. The system that acted on their work was almost entirely male. This is a structural feature of the 1944 intelligence apparatus, and it is not incidental. What Ultra changed most profoundly about the character of the Normandy campaign was the nature of risk for the Allied command. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery were not making decisions in genuine uncertainty about the broad shape of German intentions. They had, by mid-July, a running account of German strategic thinking that was more current and more detailed than anything their German counterparts could assemble about Allied intentions. The disparity produced a campaign in which Allied commanders sometimes appeared, to their own troops, to be moving with inexplicable confidence or inexplicable caution. Confident where confidence seemed unwarranted, cautious where the situation appeared to demand urgency. Both responses were, in many instances, products of an information advantage that could not be publicly acknowledged. The ultra-secret didn't just change what the Allies knew, it changed how they had to behave about what they knew, and it changed the written record of why they did what they did. 30 years of Normandy historiography was produced without this context. Some of it still hasn't been fully revised. Saint-Lô, the city bought with blood and given away. Robert Leblanc was a French journalist and resistance member who spent the occupation years in Normandy and who, after the liberation of Saint-Lô in July of 1944, wrote a series of letters to an American correspondent that were eventually published under the title Lettres à un ami américain, Letters to an American Friend. His letter of approximately the 25th of July reads, "Your soldiers are here. They are kind. They give cigarettes and chocolate. They do not understand why we do not smile more. It is because there is nowhere left to look that does not contain a memory of what stood there before." The American soldiers had been trying to take Saint-Lô for 6 weeks. It cost the 29th Infantry Division alone several thousand casualties to get there. When they arrived, what they found was approximately 2 square kilometers of rubble, a pre-war population of 12,000 reduced to a traumatized remnant, and the road junction that the entire operation had been designed to secure. The junction worked. The city was gone. Saint-Lô sat at the convergence of 5 major roads in the Norman interior. Highway N172 ran south to Vire. N174 ran southwest toward Avranches and the gateway to Brittany. D999 connected east toward Caen. For Bradley's Operation Cobra, the massive armoured breakout planned for late July, control of the Saint-Lô road junction was not optional. Without it, the armoured columns couldn't be routed south and west. Without it, the breakout had no geometry. The military necessity was precise and documentable. It was also, from the perspective of the 12,000 people who lived in and around the junction, an abstraction that arrived in the form of bombs. The city was struck by Allied aircraft 9 separate times between the 6th of June and the 18th of July, and was subjected to continuous artillery fire during the same period. The 29th Infantry Division's after-action report, covering the final assault on the city, records the capture of, and this is the precise language, an area of rubble approximately 2 square kilometers. A city is described as an area of rubble. The language is not callous by intention. It is the language of military administrative documentation, which records what was taken and what it cost, not what it contained before it was taken. The rubble notation sits in the same paragraph as ammunition expenditure figures and unit advance rates. The city had become a terrain feature. Major Thomas D. Howie commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, and he was killed by shell fire on the 18th of July, hours before his battalion entered St. Lo. His men placed his flag-draped body on the rubble of the church of St. Croix as they came through. The Associated Press correspondent Don Whitehead filed a dispatch describing the image, and the photograph and story were transmitted worldwide. Howie became the Major of St. Lo, a phrase that appeared in newspapers from New York to London, a symbol of sacrifice and liberation that gave the campaign one of its most human and reproducible images. The symbolism was genuine. The grief was genuine. The city in which his body was placed had, by the time it received him, approximately the same relationship to the pre-war St. Lo as a pile of stones has to the cathedral they once formed. His death and the city's destruction were products of the same 6 weeks. The photograph showed one of those things. The French municipal records for St. Lo, reconstructed after the war, and now held at the Memorial de Caen's archival collection, estimate approximately 5,000 civilians killed in the city and its immediate surroundings over the course of the bombardment campaign. The 29th Infantry Division's after-action report records no civilian casualties whatsoever, not because the division was concealing them, but because civilian casualty tracking was not an American military administrative responsibility in 1944. There was no field in the form for it. These two documents exist in the same archive. They describe the same events across the same period. One counts military outcomes with administrative precision. One counts human beings with archival imprecision, because so many records were destroyed along with the buildings that housed them. Together they describe a reality that neither document alone is capable of holding. The bombardment of St. Lo as a road junction required blocking those 5 convergent highways to German resupply and reinforcement. Allied aircraft dropped approximately 4,877 tons of bombs on the city and its road network in the period from the 6th of June through the 18th of July. The road junction itself, the primary military target, occupied a physical area of approximately 1.2 acres. When you divide the total bomb tonnage by the area of the primary target, the density of destruction at St. Lo exceeded 4,000 tons per acre. By any engineering or operational measure, that density vastly exceeded what was required to close a road. It was sufficient to remove the city from the map in any meaningful functional sense. Whether the excess destruction was the product of targeting imprecision, operational urgency, or some combination of both, is a question the targeting documents raise without cleanly resolving. Norman limestone construction, the dominant architectural form in St. Lo, as across most of inland Normandy, fails under explosive blast in a specific way that is different from brick or reinforced concrete. Limestone is hard but brittle. Under shockwave propagation from high explosive, it fractures in large angular fragments rather than the smaller, more traversable debris produced by brick. The streets of St. Lo after the bombardment were filled with metre-scale limestone blocks that were impassable to wheeled vehicles and extremely difficult even for tracked vehicles. The 29th Engineer Battalion spent approximately 3 days of bulldozer work clearing the main approaches after the city fell. 3 days during which the armoured columns needed for Cobra were waiting for a road that was being excavated from the rubble of the city that had been destroyed to create the start line for the operation that needed the road. The circularity is not a planning failure. It is what the operational record looks like when you follow every thread. When American soldiers entered St. Lo, they found approximately 800 German defenders. This is the number recorded in the divisional after-action reports for the final phase of the assault. 800 men, a shattered remnant of the 352nd Infantry Division and elements of the 3rd Parachute Division. 6 weeks of attrition having reduced them to a fraction of their original strength. A city of 12,000 people was bombed 9 times and assaulted by an entire American Army Corps for 6 weeks to dislodge 800 soldiers from a road junction. I don't write that sentence as a condemnation of the people who made the decision to bomb it. I write it because the arithmetic deserves to be stated in those terms at least once, without the softening of strategic context. The city of Saint-Lô was rebuilt after the war with Marshall Plan funds and contributions from American veterans associations, specifically because of the connection between the 29th Infantry Division and the city it had fought to take. Veterans of the division returned to Saint-Lô for the rest of their lives. They funded a memorial window in the rebuilt church, designed by Maxime Réal-Delsarte, depicting liberty in the form of a figure rising from broken stone. The original church it commemorates was built in the 12th century. The rebuilt church opened in the 1950s. Leblanc's letters, the ones asking why the liberated people didn't smile more, were published in a small edition that few people outside France read. Robert Leblanc was not wrong about why. He just understood something about what liberation costs its recipients that didn't translate easily across the Atlantic, to a country that received the war's victories without receiving its ruins. Operation Cobra, the carpet bombing that killed its own men. There is a transcribed radio exchange in the 1st Army Communications log for the 24th of July, 1944, that captures, in a few terse transmissions, the specific character of operational chaos. The first bombing wave for Operation Cobra was already airborne and inbound when the recall order was issued. The log records the transmission. Recall. Recall all missions. Repeat. Recall all missions. Some aircraft received the signal in time. They turned around. Others were already over the target area, in formation, on their approach runs. The bombs fell. They fell on the wrong side of the road. On the 24th of July, 1944, 25 American soldiers were killed by American bombs in a partial accidental strike that was supposed to be the opening of the operation designed to end the Bocage stalemate. The mission was classified as a failure. It was rescheduled for the following day. They launched it again. The plan for Cobra was, on paper, one of the most precisely conceived tactical operations of the Western Front campaign. Bradley intended to use approximately 2,500 Allied aircraft to saturate a rectangular bombing zone 2,500 yards wide and 6,000 yards deep along the Saint-Lô to Perrières road. American infantry would withdraw 1,200 yards north of the road before the bombing began. This withdrawal distance was the safety margin, the gap between friendly forces and the bomb impact zone, calculated on the basis of known bombing accuracy data and the acceptable risk of short rounds. The aircraft were to fly parallel to the road, east to west, meaning that any bombing errors would fall within the target rectangle, rather than north toward American positions. This was the arrangement Bradley briefed. The First Army Operational Order for Cobra, held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, reflects this parallel approach. The problem is that the Air Forces had a different understanding of the approach axis. Lieutenant General Elwood Quesada of the 19th Tactical Air Command and General Carl Spaatz of the Strategic Air Forces both objected to the parallel flight path. Flying east to west along a narrow target strip with a 6,000-yard corridor required precise formation discipline in heavy bombers that were accustomed to operating in far more forgiving geometries. The pilots would be flying extended formation runs with limited escape options if they encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire. The Air Forces wanted to fly perpendicular, north to south, directly over the American lines, across the road, and into the target area beyond. Bradley's memoir insists he approved the parallel approach and believed that was what was implemented. The Air Force planning documents show perpendicular was always what they intended. This is the most consequential source conflict in the entire campaign, a fundamental disagreement about a decision that would determine whether American soldiers lived or died, between two accounts that cannot both be correct, written by men who both had powerful reasons to record events as they wished them to have been. The Cobra bombing was rescheduled for the 25th of July. 1,800 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, accompanied by 396 medium bombers and 559 fighter bombers, crossed the front lines and delivered their ordnance over approximately 90 minutes. On the German side of the line, Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the most capable and best-equipped armoured formations in France, the division that had been fighting in the Bocage since June, was hit with a weight of explosive that its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later described in terms that have never been improved upon. He wrote, in his account recorded by Little Hart, "My front lines looked like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed." Panzer-Lehr had entered the Normandy campaign with approximately 190 operational tanks. By the evening of the 25th of July, it had approximately 15. On the American side of the line, the perpendicular bombing approach produced exactly the effect that the parallel approach had been designed to prevent. Bomb release timing errors, target marking problems, and the phenomenon known as creepback combined to drive the impact pattern progressively northward across American positions. Creepback is a documented and studied behavioral pattern in heavy bomber formations. When a lead bombardier releases at the identified target and the bombs explode, the subsequent aircraft in trail release fractionally earlier, partly from target fixation, partly from anxiety, partly because the visual cue of the preceding explosion draws the eye slightly short. In a perpendicular run across a narrow safety margin, each successive wave's bomb pattern shifted slightly toward friendly lines. The 30th Infantry Division and the 9th Infantry Division received the heaviest friendly strikes. 111 American soldiers were killed. 490 were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, who had been present in France in a classified role, under a false cover identity, as part of the Operation Fortitude deception that had him notionally commanding a phantom army group threatening the Pas-de-Calais. He died under American bombs, in a classified role, in an operation he was present to observe. His death was suppressed for weeks. The announcement, when it finally came, said only that he had died in France. The 3,300 tons of ordnance that fell on the German position on the 25th of July represented a convergence of the American industrial and air power systems that the Wehrmacht in France had no capability to match or absorb. The bombing destroyed not just Panzer-Lehr's equipment and manpower, but the coherence of the entire German defensive line in the Saint-Lô sector. The 12th SS Panzer Division and the 276th Infantry Division on either flank of Panzer-Lehr were shaken by the concussive effects of a bombardment they were adjacent to, rather than directly under. German communications in the sector collapsed under the physical destruction of wire lines and the shock incapacitation of signal personnel. Bayerlein attempted to phone his corps headquarters immediately after the bombing and found the line dead. He sent a motorcycle courier. The courier returned 4 hours later. That 4-hour gap, between the end of the bombing and the first German corps-level assessment of the damage, was part of the window through which the American armour drove. What followed the bombing was the breakthrough that the entire 6 weeks in the Bocage had been working toward. American armoured columns pushed through the shattered German line and found, for the first time since the 6th of June, open ground. Tanks could move at tank speed. The road junction at St. Lo became a traffic hub for a southward advance that, within 48 hours, had broken entirely free of the Bocage terrain. The 30th Infantry Division, which had absorbed 2 days of friendly bombing and still went forward, had been in continuous combat since the 15th of June. 40 days in the Bocage, 2 days of American bombs, and they went forward anyway. The military history of Cobra is a history of breakthrough and operational transformation. It is also a history of 111 dead Americans who were killed by the aircraft of the Air Force that was fighting the same war they were, because 2 senior officers couldn't agree on which direction the planes should fly. Byerline's post-war assessment of Cobra, recorded by Little Hart in 1946, contains a detail that I find genuinely important to the campaign's honest accounting. He stated that even without the bombing, Panzer was already at approximately 40% effective strength before the 25th of July, due to 6 weeks of attrition in the Bocage, ammunition shortages documented in the Ultra intercepts, and the relentless pressure of Allied tactical air power on its supply lines. The bombing transformed a weakened division into a non-entity. But it was already losing before the first bomb fell. This doesn't alter the moral calculus for the friendly fire deaths. Nothing alters that. What it does suggest is that Cobra's breakthrough was also, in part, the cumulative product of every day of grinding Bocage fighting that had preceded it. Every field, every hedgerow, every company-level action that the smooth operational histories compress into the phrase 6 weeks of difficult fighting. The men in those fields purchased something. Cobra was where the purchase was redeemed. The question of accountability for the Cobra-friendly fire deaths was never formally resolved. No court of inquiry was convened. No officer was charged. The Army and Air Force each had a version of events in which the key decision had been made by the other service. The men killed by the bombs were dead. The breakthrough was real. The war continued. McNair's classified presence in the theatre meant that even the full circumstances of his death couldn't be publicly acknowledged at the time. There is something in that specific combination of facts, the highest-ranking American killed in the European theatre, dying in a classified role, under American bombs, in a dispute nobody was held accountable for, that resists the clean narrative of operational success that Cobra otherwise represents. The breakthrough was decisive. The price included things that the operational triumph neither erased nor answered for. Patton unleashed. 3 weeks that rewrote the map. George Patton's diary entry for the 1st of August, 1944, the day Third Army was officially activated, is not a document of strategic reflection. It is 5 words, followed by a theological qualifier. At 1200 hours I assumed command. We are going to win this war now, God willing. This is Patton writing for himself, not for posterity, and the confidence is not performative. It is the assessment of a man who has been studying the map for 6 weeks from the sidelines, kept in reserve, nominally commanding a phantom army for a deception operation, watching the Bocage grind forward at 1 mile per day, and who can now see that the German line has been broken, and the geometry of the next 3 weeks is, if his commanders don't stop him, essentially his to determine. The gap at Avranches, through which Patton's Third Army would pour in the first days of August, was at its narrowest approximately 7 miles wide. Between the 1st and the 3rd of August, through this 7-mile opening, the American Army moved 2 armored divisions, 4 infantry divisions, their supporting artillery, their supply columns, and approximately 100,000 men and 15,000 vehicles. The bottleneck at the bridge over the Saloon River at Ponteboldt, a single crossing point that the entire operational momentum depended on, was managed by a traffic control officer whose timing system of 5-minute intervals between heavy vehicles, and whose log of those intervals survives at the National Archives. The bridge was rated for 6-ton vehicles. M4 Sherman tanks weigh 33 tons. The bridge held. History sometimes works that way. The structure that wasn't supposed to bear the weight bears it anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable. Patton's operational method in the first weeks of August was not conventional in any doctrinal sense, and the Third Army War Diary reflects this with a kind of institutional bewilderment. He divided his corps and sent them in multiple directions simultaneously: northwest into Brittany to capture the Atlantic ports, south toward the Loire to guard the army's flank, and east toward Le Mans and the German rear. The rate of advance recorded in the war diary for this period, 25 to 40 miles per day for the armoured spearheads, was not the rate that any American operational planning document had projected for a campaign that had been advancing at roughly 1 mile per day for 6 weeks. Coordination with the First Army, minimal by the war diary's own assessment. Coordination with higher command, whatever Patton decided was appropriate, which was occasionally less than Bradley would have wished. Third Army was moving too fast for the command structure to fully keep up with it, and Patton was aware of this and regarded it as a tactical asset rather than a communication failure. The German High Command's response to Patton's breakout was shaped by 3 factors that, in combination, made any coherent reaction nearly impossible. The first was speed. German formations that were supposed to establish blocking positions were reached and bypassed before they could complete their deployment, and by the time corps-level orders arrived to redirect them, the situation those orders addressed had already changed. The second was air power. Any German daylight movement on a road in the Avranches-Le Mans corridor in early August attracted P-47 fighter bombers within minutes, which meant that the mobile response the situation demanded was also the response most likely to be destroyed in the attempt. The third was intelligence. Ultra was giving Bradley and Patton a current picture of German dispositions that allowed Third Army's axis of advance to be directed specifically through the seams between German formations. Patton wasn't just moving fast. He was moving through gaps that existed because someone with the right map had shown him where the gaps were. On the 7th of August, 4 German panzer divisions, the 2nd SS, the 2nd, the 116th, and elements of the 1st SS, attacked westward out of Mortain toward Avranches, under a Hitler-ordered counterattack designated Operation Lüttich. The intent was to cut Patton's supply corridor at its narrowest point, severing Third Army from its fuel and ammunition and collapsing the entire breakout. Hitler had issued this order on the 2nd of August, over the objections of Field Marshal von Kluge, who believed the attack was strategically unsound given the current state of German forces. Ultra had intercepted Hitler's order. Bradley knew the attack was coming with more than 24 hours of warning. The 30th Infantry Division, holding the critical high ground at Hill 314 outside Mortain, was in position when the panzers came. Hill 314 did not fall, and the account of why it didn't fall is one of the better small unit stories of the entire campaign. The battalion on the hill was cut off within hours of the German attack beginning. Its communications with divisional artillery depended on a single SCR 300 radio, the standard American FM backpack set of the period, operating on 40 to 48 MHz, with a practical range of roughly 3 miles on open ground. The radio's battery had a continuous transmit life of approximately 8 hours. The battalion spent 6 days on the hill. The communications officer extended radio life by strictly rationing handset intervals, recharging batteries from the generator of a disabled half-track that had been dragged to the hilltop, and eventually cannibalizing battery cells from other equipment. The artillery direction that kept the German assault from overrunning the position was calculated and transmitted on a radio that was, by any standard specification, supposed to have been dead on day 2. Von Kluge drove to the front on the 15th of August in a staff car to assess the deteriorating situation personally and disappeared from contact for approximately 12 hours when his radio equipment failed and his vehicle came under Allied air attack. Hitler, receiving no communication from his army group commander at a moment of crisis, concluded that von Kluge was attempting to negotiate a surrender with the Allies. This was incorrect. Von Kluge was under air attack in a ditch. He was relieved of command on the 17th of August, replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, and ordered back to Germany for interrogation. On the 19th of August, while being driven east in a staff car, von Kluge took poison. He was 62 years old. The commander of Army Group B, at the moment the Army Group was being encircled, was dead by his own hand before the encirclement was complete. Model arrived at Army Group B's headquarters and spent his first hours assessing a situation that had moved past any realistic possibility of stabilization. By the 20th of August, Patton's Third Army had reached the Seine at multiple crossing points east of Paris. In 19 days of operation, Third Army had advanced approximately 300 miles, taken approximately 50,000 prisoners, and liberated an area of France that the Bocage fighting, at its grinding June and July pace, would have required months to cover. The fuel cost of this advance was approximately 400,000 gallons per day at the height of operations. The Red Ball Express truck circuit, established on the 25th of August to address the supply crisis, was not yet running. Third Army's fuel reserves on approximately the 20th of August had fallen to roughly a day and a half of supply. Patton's diary entry for the 21st of August reads, with characteristic compression, "Supreme frustration. Fuel, fuel, fuel." The army that had just rewritten the operational map of northern France was about to stop moving not because the Germans stopped it, but because the mathematics of petroleum supply ran out. The 3 weeks of Patton's advance were the kinetic resolution of something that had been building since the 6th of June. The accumulated weight of the Mulberry supply operation, the Bocage attrition, the ultra-intelligence advantage, the Cobra bombing, the American industrial dominance in tanks and aircraft and trucks. Patton drove through a door that other people died to open. That framing doesn't diminish what Third Army accomplished in those 3 weeks. The performance of the armoured formations, the command and control of multiple corps advancing simultaneously on divergent axes, the maintenance of operational tempo over 300 miles of French roads, these were achievements of the first order. But the door had to be opened first. The Bocage fields had to be paid for. Saint-Lô had to be destroyed. Cobra's bombs had to fall. Patton got the speed. The previous 8 weeks absorbed the cost that made the speed possible. The Falaise Pocket, killing ground and missed verdict. An ultra summary logged in the TNAHW1 series, carrying the designation Z/TGNI/619 and dated the 17th of August 1944, records the intercept of a transmission from German Army Group B headquarters to OKW. The message reads, "The Army Group no longer has a coherent front. All roads are under Allied air and artillery fire. The situation cannot be described as other than catastrophic." This was read at Bletchley Park within hours of its transmission. It confirmed what Allied aerial reconnaissance was showing in photographs that Eisenhower would later describe as one of the greatest killing grounds of any theatre of the war. Roads in the closing Falaise Pocket blocked for dozens of kilometres by destroyed vehicles, abandoned artillery, dead horses, and the detritus of an army that had ceased to function as a military organisation. What it didn't tell the Allied commanders, because the German signals couldn't tell them either, was how many men were still getting out. The encirclement required 2 pincers to close. In the south, Patton's 15th Corps drove north from the Mans through Argentan, reaching the town on the 12th of August. In the north, the Canadian First Army executed Operation Tractable, driving south from Caen through Falaise toward the same closing point. On the 17th of August, the gap between the 2 pincers was approximately 15 miles, a corridor through which a traffic jam of retreating German vehicles, horse-drawn supply columns, infantry on foot, and wounded men on carts was moving eastward toward the Seine, in conditions that Allied fighter-bomber pilots described in their mission reports, with a consistency of imagery that is itself documentary. Open roads, dense columns, no air cover. The P-47 pilots flew these missions until they ran out of ordnance or fuel, returned to refuel and rearm, and flew them again. The corridor was not a military problem being contested. It was, by mid-August, a movement control problem, and the movement was dying. On the 12th of August, Patton's 15th Corps reached Argentan and halted. Bradley had issued an explicit order, communicated to Patton and to Hayslip, commanding 15th Corps, not to advance north of the Army Group boundary that ran through Argentan. The Canadian Army was still roughly 20 miles from closing the northern jaw of the encirclement. The gap between the pincers was open, and it was staying open, and the German Army was moving through it. Patton's diary entry for that period is not restrained about his opinion of the situation. He wrote that they had an opportunity that came once in a century, and they were not taking it. Bradley's stated justification for the boundary order was the risk of collision between converging American and Canadian forces in the dark and the smoke and the chaos of a closing encirclement, a risk that was operationally real and had precedent in previous friendly fire incidents. This was a reasonable commander making a reasonable assessment. The reasonable assessment on this occasion let a significant number of German soldiers escape. Hans von Luck commanded Panzer Regiment 125 of the 21st Panzer Division through the Falaise encirclement, and his account in his memoir, Panzer Commander, supplemented by his testimony at the Eisenhower Center's oral history program, describes movement through the closing pocket in terms that no after-action report from the Allied side can replicate. He wrote of roads blocked by burning vehicles that had to be physically pushed aside to allow passage, of wounded men who couldn't be moved and weren't left willingly, of the continuous noise of Allied aircraft that meant any halt of more than minutes risked drawing fire. He moved primarily at night. Most of the surviving German formations moved primarily at night. Allied night air operations were substantially less effective than daytime armed reconnaissance, which is one of the reasons the escape numbers were as high as they were. The casualty figures for the Falaise Pocket are genuinely disputed in a way that matters operationally, not just historiographically. The official American estimate at the time suggested 20,000 to 40,000 Germans escaped before the gap was closed on the 19th of August. Nicholas Settling's detailed post-war analysis of German personnel records, published in his study Normandy 1944 in 2000, produces a figure closer to 50,000. German sources and some British estimates suggest figures higher than this. The range, from 20,000 to potentially over 100,000, depending on the source and methodology, is not a minor rounding error. It's the difference between an encirclement that effectively ended German military coherence in the West and one that preserved enough institutional capacity to sustain another 9 months of war. The actual figure matters because it determines how many of the men who fought at Arnhem in September, at the Bulge in December, and on the Rhine in March had previously fought in Normandy and escaped at Falaise. Among those who escaped through the gap before it closed were the commanding generals and senior staff officers of several of Germany's most capable armoured formations. The cadres of the 1st SS, the 2nd SS, the 9th SS, and the 10th SS Panzer Divisions crossed the Dives River and the Seine with comparatively little equipment, but with their command structures and their institutional knowledge of how to operate armoured forces in modern combat. Equipment could be replaced from German industrial production, which was still, astonishingly, running at relatively high levels through the summer of 1944. The 88mm gun expertise, the panzer tactics, the knowledge of Allied methods and weaknesses that these formations carried out of the Falaise Pocket would reappear at Arnhem, at Bastogne, at the Reichswald. The pocket destroyed the Wehrmacht's capacity for offensive operations in France. It did not destroy the Wehrmacht. Inside the pocket, the physical destruction was of a scale that stretches the descriptive capacity of even the most thorough after-action reports. Aerial photographs taken by RAF reconnaissance on the 20th of August show approximately 100 kilometers of roads within the pocket blocked by wreckage. The German 7th Army had entered the Normandy campaign in June with an organization that included substantial horse-drawn transport, because the German Army of 1944 was, contrary to its popular image, heavily dependent on horses for logistical movement. Within the pocket, horses died in the thousands under air attack and artillery fire. The Normandy soil in the areas of heaviest fighting still yields material evidence of this. French farmers have been returning shell fragments, vehicle components, and other metallic debris from their fields every ploughing season since 1945, at a rate that the French Agricultural Ministry has estimated at several hundred items annually. The killing ground of Falaise has been composting into the Norman landscape for 80 years. The overall military assessment of Falaise, that it was a major Allied victory that destroyed Army Group B as a coherent fighting force, is accurate and supportable from every direction of the archival record. German dead in the pocket, estimated between 10,000 and 15,000. Prisoners taken, approximately 40,000 to 50,000. Armored vehicles captured or destroyed, approximately 1,800, on top of the losses already sustained since June. The German army that emerged from Normandy and crossed the Seine in the third week of August was a shadow of the force that had been holding the Atlantic Wall in June. It would never again conduct sustained offensive operations in France. In that specific sense, the campaign had achieved its central military purpose. But Falaise was also the place where the gap stayed open for approximately 72 hours while the Allied command debated boundary lines and collision risks and the logistics of a closing encirclement. Patton was right that it was an extraordinary opportunity. Bradley was right that the risk of a friendly fire collision was real. Both things being true simultaneously doesn't produce a clean verdict, and I'm not sure the historical literature has ever quite accepted that. The tendency is to either vindicate Bradley's caution or condemn his timidity, depending on which set of post-war memoir accounts you find most persuasive. The documentary record supports a more uncomfortable conclusion. A reasonable decision produced a result that extended the war, and the men who made the reasonable decision knew they were taking that risk when they made it. The fuel famine, how the greatest army in history stopped moving. On the 22nd of August, 1944, Brigadier General Everett Hughes, Inspector General of the Communications Zone, the vast logistical apparatus responsible for supplying Allied forces in France, filed an inspection report whose opening assessment is worth reading in full. Hughes wrote, "Current fuel delivery to forward units represents approximately 63% of minimum operational requirement. At present consumption rates, 12th Corps will be immobilized within 72 hours. The tonnage problem is not solvable under current transportation arrangements." This report was filed 4 days before Paris was liberated. It was filed on the same morning that Patton was driving east toward the Seine, and Bradley was planning the next phase of operations toward the German border. Hughes's report was correct. It was also, for the period of the liberation celebrations, almost entirely invisible. The fundamental geometry of the supply crisis was a problem of distance that the planners had understood in theory and underestimated in practice. Allied supply dumps, the stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, rations, and equipment that fed the campaign, had been established on and near the Normandy beaches during June and July, and at Cherbourg after its capture in late June. In the planning phase, the assumption had been that the campaign would advance steadily enough that forward supply depots would be established progressively, reducing the distance between stock and consumer. Patton's Third Army didn't advance steadily. It covered 300 miles in 19 days. The supply depots were still in Normandy. The army was approaching the Meuse. Trucks carrying fuel from the Normandy coast to Patton's forward echelons were driving round trips of 800 miles on French roads. The trucks burned fuel to deliver fuel. The longer the line of communication, the more of the cargo was consumed by the journey. at some trip distance, and 800 miles was past it. The mathematics of forward supply become self-defeating. The arithmetic can be stated plainly. Patton's Third Army at the height of its advance consumed approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. Moving that fuel forward required approximately 22,000 truckloads per day from the beach supply points, assuming a round trip of 400 miles, which was the actual average by mid-August. The American Army's total operational 2.5-ton truck fleet in the theater at this point was approximately 28,000 vehicles. When you account for vehicles undergoing maintenance, vehicles committed to other supply lines, and vehicles already in the process of a multi-day round trip, the mathematics produce a result that is very close to impossible. Hughes's report was not pessimism, it was arithmetic. The Red Ball Express was the institutional response to this crisis. Established on the 25th of August, the same day Paris was liberated, the same day the liberation photographs were being taken on the Champs-Élysées. It was a one-way truck circuit running from supply points near Saint-Lô, northward, and then east along dedicated road lanes that were closed to all other military and civilian traffic. Directional traffic control, priority loading, and 20-hour operating schedules pushed the delivery rate as high as 12,500 tons per day at the system's peak in September. At its operational height, approximately 6,000 trucks were running the circuit simultaneously. Of those 6,000 trucks, approximately 75% were driven by African American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, men serving in segregated units under a military establishment that maintained racial separation in assignments, facilities, and formal recognition, while simultaneously depending on their labor to keep the most ambitious military advance in Western history moving. This fact was noted in Hughes's inspection reports. It was absent from the contemporary press coverage. It has been systematically underrepresented in the campaign histories produced in the decades since. The source conflict in the supply records for this period is itself revealing of how institutional pressure shapes documentation. General Lee's Communications Zone Command reported in its August summaries that forward delivery was meeting 75 to 80% of requirements. Patton's Third Army G4 Supply Officer's log, also in the National Archives, records receipt of 55 to 60% of requisitioned tonnage for the same period. Both documents are official records. Both are internally consistent. The 20% gap between them is explained by the difference between what ComZeed was counting, tonnage loaded onto trucks at Normandy supply points, and what Third Army was counting, tonnage arriving at core dumps. Everything that happened to a truck between those 2 points, breakdowns on damaged roads, diversions to higher priority units, theft, traffic delays, mechanical failures, fell into the gap between the two numbers. That gap was, in operational terms, the difference between an army that could advance and one that was standing still. Hughes's diary, personal rather than official, held at the Library of Congress, records a finding from his August inspection that the official report treats with considerable care. He discovered that a significant quantity of petroleum was disappearing from forward supply points without being accounted for in the delivery records. His estimate was that up to 10% of POL moving through certain forward points was unaccounted for, diverted to the French civilian black market, siphoned for personal use, or simply lost in the administrative chaos of a supply system operating far beyond its designed capacity. 10% sounds modest. In a supply system already delivering 63% of minimum requirements, losing another 10% of what did move was operationally significant. Hughes recommended a military police investigation. The recommendation was not implemented, partly because the investigation would have required pulling resources from forward logistics operations that were already understaffed. The Pluto pipeline under the ocean, was supposed to resolve a significant portion of the fuel delivery problem by providing a direct undersea connection from English fuel terminals to France. The pipeline used a technology borrowed from submarine telegraph cable manufacturing. An internal petroleum conduit jacketed in lead-sheathed armoured cable, laid on the channel bed by specially equipped cable ships. The design was capable of delivering approximately 1 million gallons per day at full operation, roughly a third of Third Army's daily consumption, delivered directly without requiring a single truck. Pluto became operational in late August 1944 and immediately began experiencing corrosion failures in its early sections, because the combination of high-pressure petroleum and the electrochemical environment of the channel floor was degrading the lead sheathing faster than the design had projected. Initial delivery was approximately 300,000 gallons per day, 30% of design capacity. The technology functioned. The installation, rushed and imperfect, did not. What the fuel crisis of August and September 1944 produced, beyond the immediate operational halt of Third Army and the broader Allied advance, was a strategic argument about priorities that would shape, and arguably distort, Allied operational decision-making for the remainder of the war. If fuel was the binding constraint, then the question of who received the available fuel was simultaneously a tactical and a strategic choice. Patton's Third Army driving east toward the German border required fuel. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, driving northeast toward Antwerp, required fuel. Both could not receive full allocations from a supply system delivering 63% of minimum requirements. The decision about which axis to sustain was ostensibly a military judgment. It was also a political question about British and American relative prestige, about coalition management, and about Eisenhower's relationship with both Montgomery and Patton. The fuel shortage didn't just stop the advance. It forced a decision about what kind of war the Allies were going to fight in the autumn of 1944. And the decision was made under conditions of scarcity and coalition pressure that made every option look worse than it should have been. The Red Ball Express drivers worked 20-hour shifts on open roads in vehicles that offered minimal weather protection, over French road surfaces that were being destroyed by the continuous heavy traffic faster than engineer units could repair them. By late September, the road damage on the primary Red Ball circuit was severe enough that average truck speeds had fallen from the intended 25 miles per hour to approximately 15, which further degraded the delivery rate and increased fuel consumption per ton delivered. The system was exhausting its own infrastructure in the process of using it. This is, in microcosm, the same paradox that defined the entire Allied supply situation in August and September of 1944. The speed of the advance created the crisis, and the systems deployed to resolve the crisis were consumed by their own operation. The greatest logistical machine the world had ever assembled was, by the third week of August, running on a margin so thin that a single German counterattack in the right place at the right moment might have broken it entirely. There was no counterattack. The margin held. But it held by less than the triumphal accounts of the liberation period suggest. The Paris question, Eisenhower's problem he didn't want to solve. There is a supply estimate in the Schaeff records, dated the 19th of August, 1944, stamped for the Supreme Commander's eyes only, that contains a paragraph which explains, better than any military history, why Eisenhower spent the better part of 2 weeks trying not to liberate Paris. The document calculates the daily tonnage requirement for the Parisian civilian population upon liberation: food, fuel, medical supplies, coal, and arrives at a figure of between 3,500 and 4,000 tons per day. It then notes, with the precision of a man delivering unwelcome news to a powerful employer, that this represents 20 to 25% of current forward supply capacity. The final line reads that liberation of Paris at this time is not supportable without the abandonment of one core-level operation. Eisenhower received this document. He read the numbers. He understood exactly what liberating Paris would cost in operational terms. And then Charles de Gaulle told him, with varying degrees of diplomatic courtesy depending on which account you believe, that the numbers were not the point. The strategic logic of bypassing Paris was sound by any military calculation. Paris was not a German defensive strongpoint in late August of 1944. It was a city of roughly 2 million people, administratively complex, with a German garrison that was increasingly uncertain of its orders and its future. The direct route to the German border didn't run through Paris. Eisenhower's operational plan was to encircle the city, cut its communications, and continue the advance east, leaving Paris to fall of its own weight without the Allied supply chain absorbing the cost of feeding it. The plan was rational. It was also, as de Gaulle understood with a clarity that Eisenhower found irritating, politically impossible from the French perspective, and probably from the American perspective as well, once the liberation photographs started moving on the wire services. De Gaulle's position was not purely emotional, though the emotion was real enough. He had spent 4 years constructing the legitimacy of the Free French movement from a position of near-complete military and political weakness, arguing to Roosevelt, to Churchill, to the Allied command structure that France had not surrendered in any permanent sense, that the France that signed the armistice with Hitler in 1940 was not the France that de Gaulle represented. His authority depended on being seen to liberate Paris. A Paris liberated by American forces, while French units sat in reserve, would have been a political catastrophe for everything he had built since 1940. The city wasn't a military objective for de Gaulle. It was the physical proof of his entire political argument. The Parisian uprising that began on the 19th of August complicated everyone's calculations simultaneously. French resistance fighters, including, critically, the communist-affiliated Francs Tireurs et Partisans, who had their own political reasons for wanting to be seen liberating the capital, seized government buildings, police stations, and post offices across the city. The German garrison under General Dietrich von Choltitz responded with something less than the full suppression his orders required, for reasons that his own post-war memoir and Raoul Nordling's account of the negotiations make somewhat ambiguous. Von Choltitz wrote, in Brent, Paris, Is Paris Burning?, published in 1950, that he refused Hitler's demolition orders out of moral revulsion at the destruction of a great European city. Nordling, the Swedish consul general who served as intermediary between the resistance and the German garrison, offered a less flattering but possibly more accurate reading. Von Choltitz knew the war was lost, wanted to be captured by Western forces rather than Soviet ones, and calculated that surrendering a mostly intact Paris to the Allies was a better personal outcome than being held responsible for its destruction. Both accounts may contain truth. Neither is entirely satisfying as a complete explanation for why a German general with explicit orders to demolish 45 Seine bridges and the Eiffel Tower did not carry them out. Hitler's demolition orders for Paris were explicit and documented. Von Choltitz was instructed to prepare and execute the destruction of all Seine crossings within the city, all buildings of military significance, the Eiffel Tower as a radio platform, and the major infrastructure installations that would make the city functional for an occupying force. He had the explosives. The charges were prepared, in some cases positioned. He did not detonate them. In the weeks after the liberation, von Choltitz would be described by the French press and eventually by international popular history as the man who saved Paris. A characterization that he accepted gracefully and that his post-war reputation rested on. What this characterization consistently omitted was his command record in Rotterdam in 1940, where he had served during the bombing that destroyed the city's center, and his conduct in Sevastopol in 1942, where his unit's actions toward the civilian population were the subject of post-war investigation. The man who saved Paris had not always been inclined toward restraint. The circumstances of August 1944 were specific, and von Choltitz's calculations in those specific circumstances happened to align with the survival of the city. That it also happened to be the right outcome doesn't erase the complexity of the man who produced it. De Gaulle's memoir records that he informed Eisenhower, on approximately the 20th of August, that if Allied forces did not move on Paris, he would order General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armoured Division to advance independently, whatever the operational orders said. Eisenhower's papers do not record an ultimatum in those terms. Butcher's diary, the most reliable contemporaneous account of the Supreme Commander's daily dealings, notes that de Gaulle indicated with some emphasis that the political situation in Paris required French military presence at the earliest possible moment. The difference between an ultimatum and a strong indication is significant in diplomatic terms, and neither man wrote the other's exact words down. What both accounts agree on is that Eisenhower made the decision to approve the advance on Paris on the 22nd of August, that the operational order directed Leclerc's division to lead with the American 4th Infantry Division following, and that this sequencing was a deliberate political gesture, ensuring that the first soldiers entering Paris would be French. The supply cost was accepted, the operational risk was accepted. The decision was, in the end, not a military one. On the night of the 24th of August, while most of Paris was waiting, and most of Leclerc's division was still south of the city, a small reconnaissance column commanded by Captain Raymond Dron drove through the outer suburbs and into the city proper. 9 tanks, 10 half-tracks, 3 armoured cars. They reached the Hôtel de Ville at approximately 22 hours. Church bells began ringing across the city, the first time they had rung freely since the German occupation began in June of 1940. The formal liberation, with its ceremonies and official entries and tactical clearance of German holdouts, would happen the following morning. What Parisians remembered as their liberation, what the memoirs and the oral histories and the letters home describe as the moment, was a group of dirty, exhausted tanks arriving in the dark on a Tuesday night, and the bells beginning. The Sherman tank that led Dron's column into Paris was named Romilly. It was an M4A2 variant, powered by twin General Motors diesel engines rather than the Ford gasoline engine of the standard American M4, because the French army had standardized on diesel fuel for logistical reasons. Its driver was Sergeant Marcel Bizien of Brittany. The tank's name is in the records. Bizien's name is in the records. What happened to Bizien after the liberation of Paris is not recorded in any document I've been able to find. He drove the first Allied tank into Paris, and then history lost track of him, as history consistently loses track of the men who do the specific physical acts that the ceremonies celebrate. De Gaulle walks down the Champs-Élysées and lies about everything. The Combat newspaper, one of the principal publications of the non-communist French resistance, edited during the occupation years by writers who included Albert Camus, published an edition on the 26th of August, 1944, that contained a dispatch written before the Liberation March, but published after it. The dispatch read, "Paris liberated by its own people. This was the resistance's liberation, not the army's gift. We will not forget who was in the streets when the Germans came for us. We will not forget who was in London." The combat editors were not wrong that the resistance had paid a price. Between 1940 and 1944, thousands of French men and women had been arrested, deported, shot, or tortured by the German security apparatus and its French collaborators. The resistance's contribution to the liberation was real, documented, and costly. What the combat dispatch was watching, as the march proceeded down the Champs-Élysées on the 26th of August, was its political leverage evaporating in real time, absorbed into a ceremony whose framing was entirely de Gaulle's to control. De Gaulle's central anxiety in the last days of August was not German military resistance. Von Choltitz was already negotiating his surrender. It was the Allied military government of occupied territories, the AMGOT framework, that the American government had prepared for the administration of liberated French territory. treating France under the same provisional governance structure being applied to Italy. Roosevelt distrusted de Gaulle personally, doubted the legitimacy of his self-appointed authority, and had kept the AMGOT option open until very late in the planning process. De Gaulle needed to establish French sovereign authority over Paris through an act so public, so visually unambiguous, and so thoroughly French that any subsequent American attempt to impose administrative governance would look like the occupation of an already functioning nation-state. The march down the Champs-Élysées was that act. It was magnificent. It was also precisely calculated. The shooting that broke out during the march has never been fully explained, and I say that not as a rhetorical hedge, but as a straightforward archival statement. Multiple contemporary accounts describe shots fired from rooftops and upper floor windows along the route during the procession. The Gendarmerie Nationale's incident report records 17 separate shooting incidents in the vicinity of the march. The report cannot attribute most of them to a specific actor or cause. The possible explanations include residual German soldiers or French milice snipers, panicking French forces of the interior members who began firing at imagined targets, and celebratory gunfire, weapons discharged into the air by jubilant resistance who hadn't fully thought through where the bullets would come down. Possibly all four explanations contributed to different incidents. What is documented is that de Gaulle did not duck. He kept walking at the same pace, slightly ahead of the crowd, his height making him visible for hundreds of meters in any direction. Whether this was extraordinary physical courage, a calculated performance of invulnerability, or both, it became one of the defining images of the liberation and of de Gaulle's political persona for the following 3 decades. De Gaulle's speech at the Hôtel de Ville on the 25th of August is one of the more carefully constructed pieces of political rhetoric in the entire archive of the Second World War. Its central claim that Paris had been liberated by herself, liberated by her people, with the help of the armies of France, with the support and the help of all France, was a statement that required considerable narrative architecture to sustain. The armies of France it mentioned were real. The people's liberation was real, at cost. What the speech contained no mention of whatsoever was the United States Army, the British Army, the Canadian Army, the Polish formations that had fought at Falaise, or the several 100,000 Allied soldiers who had spent 80 days making it possible to deliver that speech in that building on that day. The British and American press noted the omission. Eisenhower's aide Butcher recorded in his diary that the French seemed to believe they had won the war, and added, with a restraint that suggests genuine effort, that he would let them keep the thought. The liberation of Paris involved a political settlement that was being written at the same time as the march was happening, and part of what was being settled was the status of the communist resistance. The Francs-tireurs et partisans had fighters in Paris. They had political organization. They had credibility built from 4 years of genuine underground resistance against genuine danger. In the days immediately following the liberation, de Gaulle moved with considerable efficiency to integrate FTP military units into the reconstituted French army under regular command structures, which meant under his authority, while the FTP's independent political apparatus was effectively sidelined. Documents in the Archives Nationales record FTP complaints about this process, addressed to de Gaulle's provisional government, and returned without substantive response. The communist resistance had fought to liberate France. The liberated France they woke up in had a different political architecture than the one they had fought toward. The Thanksgiving service at Notre Dame Cathedral on the 26th of August was interrupted by shooting, again of uncertain origin, during the opening processional. Rounds struck the interior of the cathedral while the congregation was inside. The 2nd Armoured Division's war diary records that the cathedral's towers were being cleared by French infantry while the service proceeded at ground level. De Gaulle conducted the service to completion. The contrast between the tactical reality, soldiers clearing a building room by room above a religious ceremony, and the ceremony itself, broadcast to the world as the liberation of a great city, captures something essential about how the 25th and 26th of August, 1944, actually felt from inside. Not clean triumph, not pure joy, something more complicated and more real. A city that was still being fought over, celebrating the end of a fight that hadn't quite finished, presided over by a man who understood that the performance of liberation was as important as its military reality. The logistics of the march itself required a temporary withdrawal of elements of Leclerc's 2nd Armoured from their defensive positions on the eastern approaches to the city, creating a gap in the perimeter at the moment that German formations were within 30 kilometers to the east. Bradley accepted this risk as politically necessary. The gap was covered by artillery from the 4th Infantry Division and by combat air patrol from the 19th Tactical Air Command. The liberation of Paris was conducted under conditions of managed military risk, not performed risk, actual risk. And the men who made the decision to accept that risk, and the men who flew the cover patrols and manned the artillery, don't appear in the liberation photographs. The photographs show de Gaulle and the crowds and the tanks on the Champs-Élysées. The coverage was accurate. It was also selective, as all photographs are. The American soldier standing guard at the Arc de Triomphe during de Gaulle's march was a black American soldier from a segregated unit. He was not invited to participate in the march itself. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, one of the African-American armored units that had been fighting in France, was not included in the Liberation Parade. They were paraded through Paris 6 weeks later in a ceremony with minimal press coverage. The liberation of Paris was celebrated as a triumph of freedom and human dignity. The army that helped produce that triumph maintained racial segregation in its units, its facilities, its promotion pathways, and its recognition systems throughout the campaign and throughout the war. These two facts coexisted in August of 1944 without apparent institutional discomfort. That coexistence is part of the historical record of the liberation, even if it appears in none of the famous photographs. The German soldiers' Normandy, the view from the wrong side of the victory. There is a collection of letters in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, filed under the personnel records of the 276th Infantry Division, that passed through the German Army's Field Postal Service between June and August of 1944. They were written by an NCO, an Unteroffizier, to his wife in Stuttgart. His name is in the file. His division entered the Normandy campaign in late June and was formally disbanded in late August, with approximately 2,200 survivors from an original strength of roughly 12,000 men. His letters are not unique in the archive. Thousands of similar collections exist, in varying states of completeness, across German divisional and personal records from the period. What they are is specific, and specificity is what the general histories of the campaign consistently trade away in favor of operational scale. His letter of approximately the 8th of July reads, "We have been bombed again. I do not know how long I can describe the bombing to you. There are no words for it now. The boys who died this morning were good soldiers. I do not know what else to say about them. Tell Anna her father thinks of her." He was 31 years old. He was a professional soldier in a conventional infantry division, not a member of any ideological formation, not an officer, not someone whose name would appear in any command decision or operational order. He was one of roughly 500,000 German soldiers who fought in Normandy between June and August of 1944, and his letters are as close as the archive can bring us to what that experience felt like from inside the losing side. The word the German infantry used most consistently across letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies for the Allied fighter bombers that dominated their daylight hours was Jabo, a contraction of Jagdbomber, meaning fighter bomber. The word appears in accounts with a frequency and a specific dread that makes clear it had become not just a military designation, but a psychological category. The letter of approximately the 30th of July reads, "We only move at night now. In the day we lie in holes and wait. The yarbos circle overhead like birds of prey. There is nothing to do but wait." What this description captures is the specific paralysis that Allied air supremacy imposed on German ground operations from mid-June onward. Not just logistical disruption, though that was severe, but a compression of the operational day to the hours of darkness, which in Norman summer ran to perhaps 6 hours. Every German formation movement that required daylight risked destruction. Every supply run that required a road in daylight risked interception. The German army that fought in Normandy conducted its war in 6-hour increments of darkness, and the letters describe this not as a tactical adjustment, but as a kind of permanent siege from above. Set against the NCO's letters from the 276th Division, there is another set of documents from the same campaign that tells a completely different story about the German army in Normandy. The Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit compiled, beginning in the summer of 1944, a detailed record of the killing of Canadian prisoners of war by members of the 12th SS Panzer Division in the days immediately following D-Day. The Ardennes Abbey massacre and related killings at farm locations near Caen resulted in the deaths of approximately 156 Canadian soldiers, men who had surrendered, who were prisoners, who were killed anyway. The investigation files, held at the National Archives in College Park under RG 153, document this with witness testimony, physical evidence, and German unit records that confirm the presence of 12th SS personnel at the locations and times in question. The perpetrators were primarily 17 and 18-year-old volunteers, ideologically formed, institutionally brutalized, operating under a regimental culture that treated prisoner-taking as a sign of weakness. The contrast between the NCO writing about his dead comrades and the boys who shot Canadian prisoners is not a paradox that resolves cleanly. It's two things that were simultaneously true about the German army in Normandy, and the temptation to use one to cancel the other should be resisted. Post-war German memoirs from the Normandy campaign, most extensively those of Hans von Luck, Fritz Bayerlein, and Hans Speidel, consistently draw a distinction between the professional conduct of Wehrmacht formations and the behavior of SS units, emphasizing the former's adherence to the laws of war. This distinction is real in degree. Wehrmacht prisoner killings in Normandy were less systematic and less documented than SS killings. It is not, however, a clean distinction. Post-war investigation covered SS conduct in Normandy in detail. Wehrmacht conduct in the same period received substantially less scrutiny, partly for political reasons related to the West German rearmament project of the 1950s, and the need to build a new German army from available veteran officer pools. The comfortable narrative, SS as criminal, Wehrmacht as professional, served Reconstruction politics more cleanly than the historical record supported. The supply situation facing German infantry in the Norman interior by mid-July was a condition of near-total material deprivation. German frontline units in the 276th and 352nd Divisions were receiving an estimated 40% of their ammunition allocation, a figure documented in the same ultra-intercepts that Bradley was reading in his headquarters. Rations had been reduced to emergency levels. Armoured support was sporadic, because the panzer divisions were being held in the Caen sector. German divisional war diaries from this period record the same information from the opposite direction that American after-action reports record. Static fighting, heavy losses, mounting shortfalls. The material imbalance between the two armies by mid-July was near total. The German soldier in the Bocage was being asked to hold positions with 40% of his ammunition against an enemy receiving 2.5 times his minimum requirements in daily supply. He was also being told that the war was going well because the German press and radio continued to present the Normandy fighting as a defensive success. The letter of approximately the 12th of August, among the last in the file, written from somewhere in what would become the Falaise Pocket, reads, "I do not think I will write again for a while. Things are very difficult here. I keep your picture in my breast pocket. Please hold the children tight." His name does not appear in German prisoner of war records held at the National Archives. He is listed in the Bundesarchiv personnel records as vermisst, missing. The 276th Division was disbanded on the 23rd of August 1944, with approximately 2,200 survivors. He was probably not among them. The archive is silent about exactly what happened to him, and the silence is its own kind of record. The record of what the Falaise Pocket did to the men inside it, at the level that no operational summary can reach. The German army that entered Normandy in June of 1944 was not a monolithic institution with a single character. It was an organization containing professional soldiers writing careful letters home, ideological formations killing prisoners, men exhausted by 5 years of war, and men who had barely finished their training. Officers applying classical military doctrine with considerable skill, and officers paralyzed by the requirement to await Hitler's authorization for every significant decision. The campaign's outcome was determined by the material imbalance between the two sides. In aircraft, in tanks, in supply tonnage, in industrial capacity, and by the intelligence advantage that Ultra provided. But it was also determined by what happened at the company and battalion level, in the fields and the foxholes and the road junctions, by men on both sides of the line who were, in most cases, doing approximately what they had been trained to do in service of the organizations that had formed them. The moral weight of those organizations was not equal. The human experience of the men inside them was more complicated than the strategic outcome allows us to acknowledge, if we're being honest about it. What the numbers say. The campaign in raw data. There is a document in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, filed in Record Group 331 that is stamped Draft, Not for Publication, and dated the 3rd of September 1944. It is the SHAEF Historical Section's preliminary campaign summary, the first serious attempt by any Allied administrative body to add up what the 80 days between the 6th of June and the 25th of August had actually cost. The summary contains a table. The table lists, in sequence, total Allied casualties at approximately 209,672 killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties estimated at 450,000 to 500,000. French civilian casualties estimated at between 19,890 and 22,000 direct war-related deaths. Normandy regional structures destroyed or severely damaged, approximately 77,000 buildings. These numbers are not commonly cited together, in the same sentence, in the same breath. The campaign's human arithmetic is usually presented in its component parts. Allied losses in one chapter, German losses in another, civilian losses in a footnote, if at all. The preliminary summary put them all in one table. The table is still there. It still adds up to the same total. The Allied casualty figure of approximately 209,672 is broken down in the SHAEF Adjutant General's records into American losses of approximately 125,847 and British and Canadian losses of approximately 83,825. These are the numbers that encompass the men who died at Omaha Beach, the soldiers killed by American bombs at Cobra, the tank crews lost at Goodwood, the paratroopers who jumped into the channel, the engineers who assembled Mulberry B in Force 6Cs, the infantrymen who spent 40 days in the Bocage at 219 casualties per day. They are formal administrative numbers, verified by hospital admission records and unit morning reports where those records survived, estimated from order of battle calculations where they didn't. They are the most accurate count available. They are not a complete count. The German casualty figure is genuinely disputed in the scholarly literature. And the dispute is not a minor rounding difference. The Schaef preliminary estimate of 450,000 to 500,000 total German casualties is significantly higher than the figure produced by Nicholas Settling's meticulous analysis of German personnel records in his study, Normandy 1944, published in 2000, which arrives at a figure closer to 290,000. The gap of 150,000 to 200,000 is attributable to different methodological choices. Schaef included administrative and non-combat losses that Settling counts separately. The two analyses use different criteria for counting prisoners, and German records for some formations were partially or wholly destroyed in the Falaise Pocket and its aftermath. Neither figure is fabricated. Both are honest attempts to count something that resists precise counting. The honest position is to acknowledge the range and the reasons for it, rather than to present either number as settled. The French civilian casualty figure is where the preliminary summary is most clearly incomplete, and where the gap between the contemporary estimate and subsequent research is most significant. The Schaef figure of approximately 20,000 French civilian deaths in the Normandy campaign specifically has been revised upward by every major French research effort since the 1980s. The Memorial de Caen's research project, the most comprehensive effort to date, estimates approximately 20,000 civilian deaths in the Normandy campaign area, broadly consistent with the Schaef figure for that specific region, but adds an estimated 13,000 or more civilian deaths in other parts of France, caused by Allied bombing in the pre-invasion transportation campaign, the systematic effort to destroy the French rail network and road bridges that preceded D-Day. The total French civilian death toll attributable to the full liberation campaign, pre-invasion bombing, the Normandy fighting, the bombing of Saint-Lô, the destruction of Caen, the Falaise killing ground, may approach 50,000 people. This figure appears in French academic and memorial literature. It does not appear in most English-language histories of Operation Overlord. The civilians who died under Allied bombs were French. The histories of what killed them have been written primarily in English, and primarily by people whose national military forces were doing the bombing. Allied tank losses in the campaign ran to approximately 4,000 vehicles, American and British combined, against German tank losses of approximately 2,200 destroyed, plus roughly 1,800 more captured or abandoned at Falaise. That the Allies could sustain losses of 4,000 tanks and maintain operational momentum is explained by a single production comparison. American factories produced approximately 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks during the entire war. Germany produced approximately 8,500 Panzer IV tanks and variants across the entire production run. The Sherman was, by most technical comparisons, an inferior tank to the Panzer IV, and substantially inferior to the Panther and the Tiger. It won anyway, because there were more than 5 of them for every German tank produced. The Normandy campaign was decided by the factories of Detroit and Dearborn, as much as by the soldiers in the fields of the Cotentin. Allied aircraft flew approximately 480,000 sorties over the Normandy theatre between the 6th of June and the 25th of August. Against this, the Luftwaffe flew approximately 100,000 sorties in the same period, of which fewer than 20,000 were over Normandy itself. The ratio of Allied to German air activity in the campaign theatre was approximately 24-1. Allied aircraft losses totaled approximately 4,101. Luftwaffe losses approximately 2,127. The air war over Normandy was not a contest in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a sustained demonstration of what happens when one side has air supremacy and the other side has orders to contest it anyway. German pilots who flew over Normandy in the summer of 1944 were, in many cases, flying into situations from which statistical survival was not a realistic expectation. The total Allied supply tonnage landed on French shores and at Cherbourg between the 6th of June and the 25th of August 1944 was approximately 2.1 million tons. This breaks down to approximately 435,000 tons of ammunition, 290,000 tons of petroleum products, and 120,000 tons of rations, with the remainder comprising vehicles, spare parts, medical supplies, engineering materials, and the vast administrative tail of a modern industrialized army operating at continental scale. Against this, German supply to Army Group B over the same period was estimated at approximately 380,000 tons, of which approximately 220,000 tons were consumed in transit, as fuel for the movement itself, under the constant attrition of Allied air attack on the supply routes. The Allies delivered approximately 5.5 times more supply to their forces than the Germans could deliver to theirs. The campaign was a competition between two industrial systems as much as between two armies, and the industrial competition was settled before the first soldier stepped off a Higgins boat. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, on the bluff above Omaha Beach, contains 9,388 graves. This is the most visited American military cemetery in the world, and it is, in almost every cultural representation of the Normandy campaign, the place where the human cost is acknowledged and honored. 9,388 graves. American casualties in the campaign were approximately 125,847. The cemetery holds less than 8% of the American dead. The rest went home to family plots in Iowa and Georgia and California, or to other cemeteries, or into the permanent missing in action records of men whose remains were never recovered from the Channel or the Bocage or the Falaise killing ground. The cemetery is a real and important place of memory. It represents, at any given moment of reflection, a fraction of what it symbolizes. The gap between the 9,000 graves visible on the bluff and the 125,000 casualties in the records is not a concealment. It's simply what the scale of the campaign looks like when you stand in one place and try to see all of it. August 25th, 1944. What the 80 days built and what they left unfinished. Eisenhower's diary entry for the 25th of August, 1944, is not the entry of a man at the summit of his achievement. It is the entry of a man looking at the next problem. He wrote that Paris was free, that the news had arrived that afternoon. He wrote that they were behind schedule and behind on supplies. He wrote that they would regroup and resume the advance. And then the entry ends. The war is not over. 3 sentences about the liberation of the French capital. The remainder of the entry is logistics. This is not stoicism or professional detachment or any of the qualities that biographers have attributed to it. It is an accurate assessment of where the campaign stood on the 25th of August, 1944, and it is more honest about what the 80 days had accomplished, and what they hadn't, than almost any celebratory account written afterward. At 15:30 hours on the 25th of August, General von Choltitz signed the formal surrender document of the Paris garrison in the Hôtel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli. The document is 2 paragraphs long. It is held at the Service Historique de la Défense in Vincennes, and it is, like most surrender documents, an anticlimactic piece of paper, a formal administrative acknowledgement of a military reality that had been obvious for several days. At approximately 1900 hours, the last German artillery round fired in the Paris sector landed in the 14th arrondissement, on the Rue d'Alésia. It killed a 47-year-old woman named Marguerite Bruneau. Her death is recorded in the Paris Municipal Archives, the daily register of deaths maintained by the city's administrative apparatus, which continued functioning through the occupation and the liberation, with the particular institutional persistence of bureaucracies that outlast the governments they serve. Marguerite Bruneau does not appear in any official account of the liberation of Paris. She was the last person killed in the city by the fighting. History has no mechanism for marking its last casualties. The military achievement of the 80-day campaign was substantial and documentable from every direction of the archival record. Army Group B had entered the Normandy campaign in June of 1944 as one of the most capable military formations in the Western Theatre, with 9 panzer divisions, dozens of infantry and parachute formations, and the advantage of fighting from prepared defensive positions against an amphibious assault. By the 25th of August, Army Group B had lost an estimated 450,000 men by Schaeff's count, killed, wounded, or captured, had seen its armoured strength reduced from approximately 1,500 operational tanks to a few hundred, and had been driven from France entirely. It would never again conduct sustained offensive operations in France. The campaign's stated strategic objective, the destruction of German military power in northern France, and the establishment of a secure lodgment from which operations toward Germany could proceed, had been achieved in 80 days, approximately 10 days ahead of the most optimistic pre-invasion timeline. And yet, the word that Eisenhower's diary entry keeps nudging toward, that the supply estimates and the logistics reports and the operational orders of late August collectively point toward, is Antwerp. The port of Antwerp, Belgium, the largest port in northwestern Europe, with a designed cargo throughput of approximately 40,000 tons per day, more than sufficient to resolve the Allied supply crisis at a stroke, was still in German hands on the 25th of August. More critically, the Scheldt estuary, the 80-kilometre waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea, without which the port was inaccessible to ocean shipping, was still defended by the German 15th Army on its northern bank. A captured Antwerp without a cleared Scheldt was a warehouse you could see and couldn't enter. The failure to prioritise Scheldt clearance in August and early September of 1944, when the German 15th Army was withdrawing and the Scheldt's northern bank was, brief, poorly defended, would require a separate campaign, Operation Infatuate, in late October and November, at a cost of thousands of additional Allied casualties. That campaign and the months of supply crisis that preceded it extended the war in the West by a period that serious historians estimate at somewhere between 3 and 6 months. The post-war memoirs of the 4 senior Allied commanders describe the decision-making of August and September through lenses ground so precisely to each man's preferred self-image that reading them sequentially is an exercise in methodological vertigo. Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, describes a campaign of unified Allied effort, sound strategic judgment, and decisions reached through rational coalition consultation. Montgomery's memoirs, published in 1958, argues with consistent emphasis that the campaign was won by a coherent British strategic design, drawing German armour to the British sector, whose implementation was complicated by American commanders who couldn't follow a plan they hadn't written. Bradley's A Soldier's Story, 1951, presents its author as the patient professional, managing both Montgomery's obstinacy and Patton's impatience, while providing the actual operational thinking. Patton's diary, published posthumously in 1947 as War as I Knew It, suggests that Patton identified every correct decision before anyone else made it, and was consistently prevented from implementing it by the timidity of his superiors. All 4 accounts are self-serving to degrees that range from understandable to shameless. All 4 contain genuine operational insight. The campaign cannot be adequately reconstructed from any single one of them, which is why the archival record, the unit diaries, the ultra summaries, the logistics reports, the civilian testimonies, matters so much more than the memoirs. The France that emerged from the liberation of August 1944 was not the France that the liberation photograph suggested, a nation of unanimous joy and unambiguous gratitude. The épuration sauvage, the wild purge, the settling of accounts with collaborators and suspected collaborators that began even before the liberation was complete in many regions, resulted in an estimated 9,000 to 10,000 extrajudicial deaths across France in the months following August. This was not a marginal phenomenon. It was a sustained social violence, directed sometimes at genuine collaborators, sometimes at personal enemies, sometimes at women whose relationships with German soldiers had been consensual and were reframed as betrayal under the specific political pressures of the liberation moment. The resistance newspapers published calls for restraint. The restraint was partial and temporary. The France that the 80-day campaign liberated spent its first months of freedom conducting a significant portion of its own internal reckoning outside any legal framework. I've been sitting with this material for a considerable time now. The diaries, the after-action reports, the logistics tables, the intercepted German signals, the French civilian testimonies, the letters that made it home, and the letters that didn't. What I keep returning to, at the end of it, is not a verdict. It's something more like a question about what we ask military campaigns to be. Operation Overlord achieved everything it was designed to achieve. It drove the German army from France. It liberated Paris. It established the lodgment from which the war in the West would eventually be won. And it destroyed a medieval city, killed somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 French civilians, produced a supply crisis that extended the war by months, liberated Paris with an army that was still racially segregated, and created a post-war historical record in which the commanders who made the decisions couldn't explain why they made them, because the most important source of their information couldn't be acknowledged for another 30 years. These things are not contradictions. They are the same campaign seen without editing. The history of Operation Overlord is still being revised. The Ultra materials became available in the 1970s. The German personnel records reached full accessibility through the 1980s. The French civilian archives, municipal records, resistance organization papers, collaboration tribunal files, were progressively opened through the 1990s and 2000s. The Mémorial de Caen's civilian casualty research was completed in 2015. There are almost certainly collections in the Bundesarchiv and in private French hands that have not yet been fully processed. Every time a new collection becomes available, the picture shifts, sometimes slightly, sometimes substantially. The Normandy campaign is not a closed historical file. It is an ongoing process of accounting, and the accounting is not finished. The 80 days between the 6th of June and the 25th of August, 1944, produced, among other things, the following: the liberation of France, the destruction of Army Group B, the beginning of the end of the German war in the West, approximately 209,000 Allied casualties, an estimated 400,000 or more German casualties, approximately 20 to 50,000 French civilian deaths, the construction and partial destruction of the most ambitious engineering project in military history, the operational debut of the world's most consequential signals intelligence program, the invention of the rhinoceros tank from German beach scrap, the execution of a political theatre of liberation that shaped French national identity for the following generation, and Marguerite Bruno, killed on the Rue d'Alésia at approximately 1900 hours on the 25th of August, the last person the fighting killed in Paris, whose name is in the municipal register and nowhere else. Every answer the 80 days produced was also a new question. That is not a flaw in the historical record. It is what the historical record is. The archive is still speaking. The accounting is not closed. And the 80 days, the longest, costliest, most consequential 80 days in the history of modern warfare, remain, in their full complexity, exactly what Eisenhower's wallet note prepared for. Something that could go either way, right up to the moment it didn't.